should have known something felt off the moment I saw the gas station on the edge of that forgotten highway. It was one of those old ones, the kind you can't believe is still open, with a flickering neon sign and pumps that probably hadn't been upgraded since the early 80s. But my tank was running low, and I hadn't seen another station in at least 50 miles. I told myself it was fine, just a quick stop, fill up, and get back on the road. It was late afternoon, and the light was starting to fade. The air felt heavy, almost too quiet. No wind, no birds, not even the hum of distant traffic. Just the steady ping of the gas pump and the faint crackle of an old radio inside the station. There was no attendant in sight, just a grimy counter and a shelf stocked with expired snacks. I waited by the pump for a minute, glancing around, but no one came out. Finally, I decided to go inside. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and the little bell above jingled weakly. The smell hit me right away. Stale air mixed with old coffee and something faintly metallic. There was a counter with a cash register and a dusty rack of maps by the window. Behind the counter, a door stood slightly ajar, leading to what I guessed was a back room or storage area. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the empty space. No answer. I walked up to the counter and tapped on it, leaning slightly to peek into the back room. Still nothing. For a second, I thought maybe the place was just abandoned and the pumps were left running. But there was a steaming cup of coffee on the counter, and a jacket draped over the chair behind it. Someone had been here. I turned back toward the door, suddenly feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt outside. I felt an itch at the back of my neck, the kind you get when you know you're being watched. Then I heard it, a faint thud from the back room. Not loud, but distinct enough to make me freeze. It wasn't the kind of noise a building makes when it settles, and it definitely wasn't a raccoon knocking over a trash can. I should have walked out right then, gotten in my car and driven away, even if it meant running out of gas 20 miles down the road. But curiosity got the better of me, or maybe it was stubbornness. Either way, I stepped around the counter and moved toward the door. "Hey," I called again, my voice quieter this time. "You okay back there?" No response. The door creaked as I pushed it open wider. The back room was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, swaying gently as if it had just been bumped. The room was cluttered with boxes, cleaning supplies, and an old metal desk covered in papers. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just a messy storage room. But then I noticed the door at the far end of the room, slightly open. A cold draft seeped through the crack, carrying with it a faint, earthy smell, like damp soil and rotting leaves. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. But something about that open door felt like an invitation I couldn't ignore. I stepped closer, my footsteps echoing softly on the concrete floor. The door led to a narrow staircase, descending into darkness. I stood at the top, peering down. The smell was stronger here, almost suffocating. I could barely make out the bottom of the stairs, where the faint outline of a dirt floor came into view. I took a step down, the old wood creaking under my weight. Then another. The air grew colder with each step, the darkness wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. By the time I reached the bottom, I could barely see anything. My phone's flashlight barely cut through the thick shadows. The floor was packed dirt, uneven and damp. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old tools, jars of God knows what, and strange bundles wrapped in cloth. Then I saw it, a large tarp in the center of the room, covering something bulky. It was stained and lumpy, with dark patches that looked suspiciously like dried blood. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was an old deer carcass or some roadkill the owner had dragged down here for some insane reason. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I moved closer, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. My fingers trembled as I reached for the edge of the tarp. Then the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. I spun around, my flashlight swinging wildly. The only light was the weak beam from my phone, illuminating the bottom half of the stairs. I sprinted toward them, my feet slipping on the damp dirt. Halfway up, I heard footsteps above me, slow and deliberate. I stopped, pressing myself against the wall, trying to quiet my ragged breathing. The footsteps moved across the floor above, pausing directly above the staircase. Then they started down, one step at a time, each creak louder than the last. I bolted. I didn't care how loud I was anymore. I flew up the stairs, slamming into the door with my shoulder. It burst open, and I stumbled into the back room, knocking over a stack of boxes. The footsteps were right behind me. I didn't look back. I tore through the gas station, my shoes skidding on the tile floor. I hit the door at full speed, bursting out into the cool evening air. My car was still parked by the pump, the driver's door wide open. I didn't remember leaving it like that, but I didn't have time to think about it. I dove into the driver's seat, jamming the key into the ignition with shaking hands. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into gear, peeling out of the lot. My tires squealed on the asphalt as I sped down the highway, the gas station shrinking in my rearview mirror. I didn't stop, not for miles, not until the neon lights of a diner came into view, glowing like a beacon in the dark. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands still trembling as I killed the engine. For a long time, I just sat there, staring out at the empty highway. My mind was a blur, replaying everything that had just happened. I thought about going inside the diner, telling anyone what I'd seen, but what would I even say? Instead, I sat there until my breathing slowed and the trembling in my hands stopped. I told myself it was over, that whatever had happened back there, it was done. But deep down, I knew I'd never really forget that gas station, or the footsteps, or the cold, dark room beneath it. And I knew, without a doubt, that I would never drive that stretch of highway again. I was already late when I got to the trailhead. The sun sat low in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The plan was to hike up to Ridgeback Peak, a challenging 15-mile round trip, and get back before dark. It was ambitious for a solo hike, but I'd done longer ones before. I figured I'd just push the pace on the way back if it got tight. The trail started easy, winding through tall pines and thick underbrush. The air smelled like dirt and pine sap, and the late afternoon light filtered through the trees in golden patches. I felt good, legs fresh, lungs taking in the crisp air without effort. About 3 miles in, the forest thinned out, and I hit the first ridge. From there, I could see the mountains stretched endlessly in every direction. The peak stood sharp and distant, maybe another 4 miles out. It looked farther than I expected, but I pressed on, telling myself it always looks worse from a distance. The trail got rougher, narrow, with sharp switchbacks and loose rocks. I slipped a few times, catching myself on nearby branches or crouching low to keep my balance. The trail didn't seem as well maintained as I thought it would be. Some of the switchbacks were washed out, and branches hung low across the path, forcing me to duck more often than I liked. A dead tree leaned at a precarious angle, its base rotted through. I gave it a wide berth, but I couldn't shake the feeling it was about to topple. An hour later, I reached a rocky outcrop that gave me a clear view of the peak. It was closer now, the jagged rocks catching the last light of the day. I sat for a minute, catching my breath and drinking some water. The wind had picked up, whistling softly through the trees below. The shadows stretched longer, creeping up the sides of the mountains like dark fingers. I knew I should turn around. I told myself it wasn't worth it. The light was fading fast, and the trail was harder than I'd planned. but something in me pushed back. I come this far and the peak was right there. I just needed another hour, maybe less. If I hurried, I could summit and still make it back to the ridge before full dark. The trail became a scramble, hands and feet slipping on loose rocks and grabbing at tree roots to pull myself up. The air grew colder, and I zipped up my jacket. My breath came in short, hard bursts. The sun dipped behind the mountains, leaving the world in that strange half-light, where everything looks washed out and gray. I reached the summit just as the last sliver of sun disappeared. The view was incredible, mountains in every direction, their peaks glowing faintly in the twilight. For a moment, I forgot about the time, the cold, and the trail. It was just me and the mountains, stretching out forever. Then the wind shifted, and I felt how cold it really was. The light was almost gone. I didn't waste time. I started back down, moving fast, almost too fast. My headlamp bounced in my pack, and I stopped to grab it, strapping it on and switching it to the highest setting. The beam cut through the darkness, casting strange shadows on the rocks and trees. The trail was harder to follow now. In the dark, everything looked different. I kept losing the path and finding it again, doubling back when I hit dead ends or slid down loose slopes. My heart pounded harder with every misstep. It wasn't long before I realized I was lost. I stopped, breathing hard, trying to slow my thoughts. The wind howled around me, pulling at my jacket and making the trees groan. I scanned the forest with my headlamp, but the beam only revealed more trees, more rocks, more shadows. I forced myself to take a breath and think. I'd been following the ridge down, so I had to be close to the main trail. If I kept moving downhill, I'd hit it eventually, right? I started walking, slower this time, scanning the ground for any sign of the path. The forest felt different, denser, darker. My headlamp barely cut through the blackness. Every step seemed louder than it should have been, crunching on leaves and snapping twigs. Time dragged. It felt like I'd been walking for hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes. The cold seeped into my bones, and my legs ached from the scramble. I kept moving downhill, hoping, praying I'd find the trail. Then I saw it. A gap in the trees, the ground flattened out. A trail. I almost cried with relief. I hurried toward it, stumbling on roots and loose rocks. When I reached it, I stopped dead. It wasn't the trail. It was an old fire road, overgrown and barely visible in the dark. I hadn't seen it on any maps, but it was something. I figured it had to lead somewhere, maybe back to the main trail or at least downhill toward the valley. I followed it. Felt wrong immediately. The road twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. It climbed when it should have descended, curved back on itself, and narrowed until it was barely a path. My headlamp flickered, and my heart jumped before the light steadied again. I was tired, so tired. My legs felt like lead, and my thoughts were getting slower, heavier. I told myself to stop, rest for a minute, but a deeper part of me screamed no. Keep moving. Asterisk, asterisk, and then I saw the cabin. It sat back from the road, half hidden by trees. The roof sagged, and the windows were dark. It looked ancient, like it had been abandoned for decades. The door hung open at an angle, creaking softly in the wind. I stood there, staring at it, every instinct telling me to walk away. But I was cold, exhausted, and out of options. Maybe I could warm up inside, gather my thoughts, and figure out how to get back. I stepped inside. The floor creaked under my weight. The air smelled like rot and mildew. My headlamp cast a dim light across the room. A collapsed table, a broken chair, piles of leaves and debris. The wind whistled through gaps in the walls. I moved to the back of the cabin, looking for anything useful. A map, a blanket, something. I found an old wood stove, its door hanging open and rusted. Nearby, a pile of wood sat rotting, but a few pieces looked dry enough to burn. I set a fire. The warmth was immediate and overwhelming. I sat close to the stove, holding my hands out, feeling life creep back into my fingers. My head felt clearer, and for the first time in hours, I started to believe I might actually be okay. Then I heard it, a sound from outside, soft but unmistakable. Footsteps. They crunched on the leaves outside the cabin, slow and deliberate. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. My headlamp was off, the only light coming from the flickering fire in the stove. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I held my breath, listening. The wind howled, but the footsteps didn't move. For what felt like an eternity, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the footsteps started again, moving away this time back into the woods. I waited, heart pounding, until I couldn't hear them anymore. I stood, careful not to make a sound, and moved to the door. The fire in the stove crackled softly behind me. I stepped outside, scanning the woods with my headlamp. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I didn't wait. I started down the fire road again, moving as fast as I dared. My legs screamed in protest, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. The road eventually led back to the main trail. When I saw it, relief washed over me like a wave. I knew where I was. The parking lot was only a few miles down. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept moving, the beam of my headlamp bouncing in front of me. The wind died down, and the forest grew quiet again, almost peaceful. I reached the parking lot just before dawn. My car was the only one there, covered in a thin layer of frost. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. Eventually, I started the engine and drove away. I haven't been back since. I still hike, but I stick to easier trails now, ones with clear paths, good cell service, and plenty of other people around. I never figured out what those footsteps were or who or what was outside that cabin. I'm not sure I want to know. I'd always been a hiker. The mountains, the forests, the winding trails, they felt like home to me. I preferred to be alone when I hiked. No distractions, no noise, just me and the earth beneath my feet. But this hike, the one I had planned for weeks, felt different from the start. It was supposed to be a simple, 2-day trek through the Redwood National Park. Nothing too intense, just enough to get away from the noise of the city and clear my head. I woke up early, packed my gear the night before, and made sure everything was in place. Food, water, a sleeping bag, a first aid kit, and my trusty knife. I checked the weather forecast, clear skies, mild temperatures, perfect hiking weather. So, I hit the road by sunrise, eager to start the journey. The first few miles were peaceful, as expected. The trail was smooth, winding through towering trees that cast long, dark shadows across the path. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind of air that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of a bird in the canopy above. I was alone, just the way I liked it. Hiking alone gives you a sense of freedom you don't get when you're with other people. No one to talk to, no one to slow you down, just the open trail and whatever thoughts came to mind. It was around noon when I came across the first sign of trouble. Well, what I would later recognize as the first sign. The trail I was following split into two paths. The main trail veered left and continued along a gentle descent, but the other path, narrow, barely visible beneath the overgrowth, curved right, deeper into the forest. I paused, studying it. I knew the park pretty well, but I had never seen this path before. It wasn't on any of the maps I'd studied, but something about it called to me. I'm not sure why I chose to go down it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe a desire for solitude, but I decided to follow it. The path was rugged, overgrown with ferns and creeping vines. I pushed through them, the underbrush scratching at my arms, but it felt good, like I was venturing into the unknown. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of birds, insects, and the wind through the trees slowly faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe I was just too deep in the forest, or maybe it was just the way the land shaped the acoustics. But as I kept going, the silence felt unnatural. It wasn't the quiet you get when you're alone in nature. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I walked on, the air growing cooler as the trees grew thicker. The path became steeper, the ground uneven, and the feeling of isolation only grew. It was then that I started hearing faint sounds, whispers almost. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but no breeze was blowing, and the trees above didn't seem to be swaying at all. I shook off the unease, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But the whispers grew louder, like they were following me. No words, just the soft rustle of voices. I looked around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. No animals, no people, nothing. Just trees, ferns, and the path ahead. It wasn't until I stumbled upon the clearing that I began to feel a real sense of dread. The clearing was small, just a patch of grass surrounded by dense trees. In the center of it was an old, weathered stone structure. It looked like some kind of ruin, but I couldn't tell what it had been. The stones were covered in moss, the structure half collapsed, with chunks of rock scattered around. I stepped closer, the whispers growing louder still. The air felt different here, thick and stale, as if the place itself had been abandoned for centuries. There was something about it that made my skin crawl. I looked around again, trying to shake off the feeling, but I couldn't. I noticed something then. A pair of footprints, fresh in the soft earth at the edge of the clearing. They were large, made by boots, the kind of boots someone who had been hiking would wear. I crouched down, studying them. They weren't mine, but that didn't make sense. No one had passed through here. The path was isolated, and I hadn't seen another hiker for hours. My heart started to race. The whispers seemed to intensify, echoing in my ears. They were coming from all around me now, like the forest itself was alive. I stood up quickly, instinctively backing away from the ruins. And that's when I saw it. The figure, standing in the shadows of the trees at the far end of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and completely still. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I blinked, it didn't disappear. It was there, watching me. My stomach tightened, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of the figure, blending into the trees. I froze, unable to move. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I call out? Should I turn back? My mind raced, but my body didn't respond. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure stepped backward, disappearing into the dense foliage. The whispering stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. I couldn't stay here. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. My heart pounded in my chest, and my legs felt like lead as I sprinted down the path. The brush scraped at my arms, the air growing colder as I pushed forward. Every step felt like it was dragging me deeper into something I couldn't escape from. I don't know how long I ran. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the path winding and twisting, but I couldn't bring myself to slow down. All I could think about was getting out, getting away from whatever was out there. My breath was ragged, my chest aching, but I couldn't stop. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled out of the trees and into a small clearing I recognized. It was one of the places I had passed earlier in the day, just before I had taken that wrong turn. The relief that washed over me was almost overwhelming. The path back to the main trail was just ahead. I slowed to a walk, trying to calm my breath. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light across the landscape. It felt like the whole world had shifted in those few hours I had spent wandering off the path. But now that I was back, things seemed normal again. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it all, if I had let my mind run wild, but something in me told me it wasn't just my imagination. I made my way back to the main trail, breathing easier with each step. The trees parted, and I saw the familiar signs of civilization. A marker, a bench, a worn sign indicating the way back to the parking lot. I had done it. I had made it out. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, not because I was scared they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't think they needed to know. I wasn't sure what I had encountered out there, whether it was just the result of being alone in the woods for too long or something more, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never stray from the marked trail again. I've hiked many trails since that day, but I've never gone back to that one. I don't know what I saw or what followed me through the trees, but I don't care to find out. Some places are better left unexplored. I decided to take a solo hike one weekend. It wasn't the smartest idea, but something about the mountains always called to me. The trail I chose was off the beaten path, not one of those touristy routes where you see people every 5 minutes. It was supposed to be peaceful, quiet, just me and the woods. I arrived early in the morning, just as the first light started to creep over the peaks. The sun was barely visible, but you could already feel the cool morning air beginning to warm. The parking lot was empty, save for my car. I pulled my backpack from the trunk, adjusted my boots, and set off. The trail was marked, but barely. I had to squint to read the faded signs. Not a lot of people come here, I thought, but that's what I liked about it. The first few miles were easy. The path was smooth, winding through thick trees, the kind of forest where the air smells like damp earth and pine. The ground was soft under my feet, and the sound of birds chirping above made me feel like I was in a different world. I was alone, but not in a bad way. It was the kind of loneliness that felt like freedom. Around noon, I stopped to take a break. The sun was higher in the sky now, casting long shadows across the trail. I found a large rock by the side of the path and sat down, pulling out a sandwich and some water. I looked around, taking in the beauty of the forest, but something felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just an odd sensation, like I wasn't entirely alone. I shrugged it off. It was probably nothing. I finished my lunch, packed up, and set off again. The path began to get steeper. The trees thinned out, and the ground became rocky and uneven. My legs were starting to feel the strain. I kept pushing forward, though. There was something about reaching the summit that kept me going, some primal need to conquer it, to stand on top and look out over everything. By mid-afternoon, I had reached the top, or at least what seemed to be the highest point of the trail. I dropped my pack on a flat rock and sat down, taking in the view. The valley below stretched for miles, dotted with patches of trees and a few winding streams. The mountains on the other side looked like shadows in the distance. It was breathtaking, and for a moment, I just sat there, lost in the beauty of it all. But then I noticed something strange. It was a sound, a low, distant thud, like something heavy dropping onto the ground. I stood up, straining to listen. There was nothing else, just the wind and the soft rustle of leaves. But the thud, it was still there, faint, like it was coming from somewhere below the trail, just out of sight. I stood frozen, trying to make sense of it. Could have been anything, an animal, a tree falling, maybe even a rock shifting. But the feeling of unease that had been creeping up on me all day suddenly intensified. I looked around again, scanning the forest below. Nothing seemed out of place, but there was a weight in the air, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. I reached for my pack, planning to head back down the way I came. But then I noticed something that made my stomach twist. A footprint, just ahead of where I was standing, half hidden in the dirt and leaves. It wasn't a bear's print or a deer's. It looked like a human footprint, but larger, deeper. The edges were sharp, like the person had been walking quickly or with purpose. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped closer, crouching to examine it. My first instinct was to turn back, to pack up and leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I had to know. Who else could be out here? The area was remote. Hardly any sign of life around except for the occasional bird or squirrel. The thud came again, this time louder. I jerked my head toward the sound, but still saw nothing. The feeling in my gut was now a full-blown sense of danger, a primal instinct telling me to run. My legs felt heavy, like they didn't belong to me anymore. I stood up, grabbed my pack, and started walking back down the trail, faster this time. The path was steeper than I remembered, my feet slipping on the loose rocks. The thud came again, closer now, like something or someone was following me. I looked behind me, but there was nothing. I broke into a jog, adrenaline surging through me. My breathing was heavy, and the sound of my footsteps felt too loud in the silence. I glanced over my shoulder, my eyes scanning the trees, but still saw nothing. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, an endless path through the woods. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of leaves, right behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the path was empty. There was nothing there, just trees and the faint rustle of the wind. I took a few more steps, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I could hear the thud now with every step I took, always just behind me, always just out of view. My mind raced, coming up with worst-case scenarios. Was it another hiker, or something else entirely? But no one should be here. No one except me. I ran again, not caring anymore about tripping or stumbling. The trail blurred in front of me. The trees were a blur of green and brown. The ground nothing but a series of obstacles. I wasn't sure how long I'd been running when I finally came to a clearing. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a small shack, wooden, old, and weathered. It looked abandoned. I hesitated for a moment. Something told me to keep running, to ignore the shack and keep going, but my legs wouldn't carry me any further. I needed a place to rest, to hide. I made my way toward it, my heart pounding in my ears. I reached for the door, hesitated again, but then pushed it open. Inside was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of mildew. There was nothing in the small space, just empty shelves and a few old tools scattered on the floor. I backed into a corner, my breath shallow and panicked. The thuds were closer now, almost deafening. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard a voice, soft but clear from the far end of the shack. "Are you lost?" I froze. No one had been out here. I hadn't seen anyone since I started my hike. But there, in the corner, I saw a man. He was sitting on an old wooden chair, watching me with calm eyes, as if he had been expecting me. "I can help you get back," he said, his voice oddly soothing. I didn't say anything. Couldn't. I just nodded and walked toward him, my legs shaky but determined. The man stood up and motioned for me to follow. As we stepped outside, I noticed that the thudding had stopped. The forest was silent again. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, the kind you only feel when you're about to escape something you don't fully understand. As we walked, he told me how the trail used to be a common route for hikers, but that it had fallen into disrepair over the years. Many had gotten lost, others had disappeared, but he'd been watching over the trail for years now, guiding those who strayed too far. We finally reached the parking lot where my car was. He pointed to the road and told me I'd be fine from here. No more strange sounds, no more shadows. I thanked him, though I couldn't help but wonder if he had ever been the one making the thuds in the woods. When I got into my car, I looked back one last time. The man was gone. The trail was silent, and for the first time in hours, I felt safe. had always been a fan of the outdoors. There was something about being out in the wilderness that made me feel more alive, more at peace with myself. So when I had the chance to take a weekend camping trip in a remote part of the forest, I jumped at the opportunity. The plan was simple: hike in, set up camp, and enjoy a quiet weekend under the stars. I didn't think anything could go wrong. After all, it was just a weekend, and I'd done this many times before. I arrived at the campsite just after noon, feeling excited and ready for the adventure. The sun was high in the sky, the air crisp and clean. The forest was quiet, with just the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird chirping in the distance. It felt perfect, like I had entered some kind of sanctuary. I had chosen this spot because it was secluded. There weren't any other campers nearby, which meant I could enjoy the peace and quiet without interruption. I found a small clearing near a stream where I could set up my tent. The ground was soft, covered in pine needles, and I felt a sense of satisfaction as I unpacked my gear. The first few hours went by smoothly. I set up my tent, built a fire pit, and gathered some firewood. By the time the sun started to dip behind the trees, I had everything ready. The fire crackled to life, sending sparks into the evening sky, and I sat back on a rock, watching the flames dance. As darkness settled in, I couldn't help but notice how quiet everything was. There were no other sounds except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of the wind. It was unnerving in a way. I was used to the sounds of nature, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, the calls of distant animals. But here, in this part of the forest, everything was still. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. I shrugged it off, telling myself that it was just the stillness of the night. I wasn't used to being out in the woods alone, but I had done it before. I was used to solitude. Besides, it was peaceful, wasn't it? I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and roasted marshmallows, sitting by the fire and watching the stars appear one by one in the sky. It was beautiful, almost magical, how clear the night sky was. I hadn't seen the stars like this in years. As the night deepened, the air grew cooler. I wrapped myself in a blanket and leaned back, staring up at the constellations. For a moment, I felt completely at ease, like everything in my life had fallen into place. But that feeling didn't last long. Something shifted in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I stood up and stretched, my muscles stiff from sitting too long. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling in the trees behind me. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound was strange, too deliberate, too close. My heart started to race as I listened, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire. The rustling stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there, just the shadows of the trees stretching out in the moonlight. I shook my head, trying to calm myself. "It's just your imagination," I told myself. "You're being paranoid." I returned to my seat by the fire, trying to convince myself that there was no reason to be afraid. But the feeling of unease didn't go away. The longer I sat there, the more I felt like something wasn't right. It was as if the woods had grown darker, more oppressive. The rustling came again, this time louder. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the woods behind me, just beyond the tree line. It wasn't an animal. It was too rhythmic, too purposeful. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack and shined it toward the source of the sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but there was nothing there. No animal, no movement, just the stillness of the forest. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, but my instincts were screaming at me to leave. I quickly began packing up my gear, deciding to move the camp further away from whatever was making that noise. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing in on me. The trees seemed to loom over me, casting long, twisted shadows. As I hurried to pack, I heard the sound again, much closer this time. It wasn't just rustling, it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking just beyond the reach of the light. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight and started walking quickly toward the trailhead. My mind was racing, but I couldn't think clearly. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing. I had to get out of there. The path to the trailhead was narrow, winding through the trees. I tried to keep my pace steady, but my legs felt like lead, and my heart was thudding in my chest. Every rustle, every crack of a twig underfoot made me jump. I glanced behind me, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel the presence of someone nearby. I quickened my pace, trying to put as much distance between myself and the camp as possible. But the path seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around me like a tunnel. I reached the trailhead, where I'd parked my car, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the quiet of the forest, as if nothing had ever happened. I got into my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I started the engine and pulled out onto the road, my mind still racing. What had I heard? Was it just my imagination? Or had someone been out there watching me? I didn't know, and I didn't care to find out. All I wanted was to get as far away from that place as possible. The drive back home felt like an eternity, the road winding through the forest with the headlights cutting through the darkness. I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps, the rustling, the feeling of being watched. My mind kept replaying the events of the night over and over again, but I couldn't make sense of it. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, staring out into the darkness. The silence of the woods seemed to follow me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I didn't go camping again for a long time after that. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe there was something in those woods that I'll never understand. But whatever it was, it's a memory that stays with me to this day. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that spot in the woods. There are some places that stay with you, no matter how hard you try to forget them. And sometimes it's better to leave certain questions unanswered. I've always been the type of person who loved the outdoors. The idea of getting away from everything, breathing in the fresh air, and sleeping under the stars. So when my friends suggested a camping trip up north, I didn't hesitate. It was a weekend thing, just a couple of days to reconnect with nature, disconnect from the chaos of daily life, and enjoy some peace. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. It wasn't too busy. A few tents scattered around, but nothing that felt overwhelming. The air was cool, the trees towering above us like ancient sentinels, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the gentle wind. We set up our tents in a small clearing, nestled between two large oak trees. It was a quiet spot, and I immediately felt at ease. I spent some time gathering wood for the fire, while the others got the tent set up and started pulling out gear. The sun was dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the camp. The sky slowly turned a deep orange, then a rich purple as the stars began to appear. There's something magical about the wilderness at night, the way it feels both alive and empty at the same time. The sounds of crickets and distant rustling in the trees filled the air. We built a fire and gathered around it, warming our hands and cooking some simple meals. The conversation was light, filled with stories and jokes. But as the fire flickered and crackled, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was subtle, but there was an odd silence in the woods, almost like nature itself was holding its breath. The wind had stopped completely, and the usual sounds of wildlife had faded away. "Did you hear that?" one of my friends asked suddenly. We all stopped, our eyes scanning the shadows beyond the firelight. A faint, almost imperceptible rustling sound came from the trees, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Probably just an animal," I said, trying to brush off the feeling. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The night wore on, and the tension in the air didn't let up. We sat in silence for a while, the crackling fire our only companion. At some point, we all crawled into our tents to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily for me. Every little sound outside made me tense, my mind racing with thoughts of things lurking just beyond the safety of the tent walls. At some point during the night, I woke up to a loud crash, something heavy hitting the ground, followed by a deep, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I lay perfectly still, trying to convince myself that it was just a bear or some other wild animal. But then there was the sound of something moving around our campsite, stepping slowly, deliberately. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully unzipped the tent, shining the beam toward the trees. The beam of light flickered, the shadows twisting unnaturally, but there was nothing there. My heart settled a little, but the unease remained. The next morning, we all gathered around the campfire again, the events of the night still hanging heavily in the air. No one spoke of the growl, but I could see the same unease in everyone's eyes. We packed up the campsite quickly, eager to get moving and put some distance between us and whatever had caused the disturbance. We decided to take a hike through the woods to clear our heads. The trail was quiet, the only sounds being our footsteps and the occasional bird call. The trees here were dense, the ground uneven, and the air smelled damp, heavy with the scent of pine. We hiked for a few hours, the landscape changing as we went higher up the mountain. The views were incredible. You could see the valley stretching out below us, the river winding through the forest. But the farther we went, the more isolated it felt. The woods seemed to close in around us, the trail narrowing, and the shadows growing longer as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. That's when we heard it, a low, almost imperceptible sound coming from deep within the trees. It was a scratching noise, like something moving through the underbrush, but it wasn't the sound of an animal. It was deliberate, slow, and methodical. We all stopped, looking at each other, unsure of what to do. "I'll go check it out," I said, trying to sound confident, but my voice wavered, betraying the fear creeping into my chest. My friends hesitated, but eventually they followed behind me as I cautiously made my way off the trail, the sound growing louder with each step. I don't know what I expected to find, but it certainly wasn't what I saw. There, just beyond a thicket of bushes, was a small makeshift camp. A fire pit, long since abandoned, sat in the center. Broken branches and scattered clothing were strewn about, as if someone had left in a hurry. But it wasn't the remnants of the camp that unsettled me. It was the marks on the trees surrounding it. Deep gouges, like claw marks, marred the trunks. Some of the marks were so high up that whatever had made them would have had to be standing on two legs. The air felt thick, oppressive, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched crept over me. "We need to go. Now," I said, my voice barely a whisper. We turned and hurried back to the main trail, not stopping to look back. The quiet was deafening as we walked, the wind picking up once more, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else, something metallic, sharp. By the time we made it back to the campsite, the sun was setting, casting everything in a blood-red glow. I felt the chill of the night seeping into my bones, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the trees, watching us. That night, we stayed close together, our fire burning brightly, casting long shadows around the campsite. No one spoke much. We ate, stared into the flames, and avoided looking too far into the woods. The feeling of unease never left me, and I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the sounds of movement in the trees, of something walking just beyond the reach of the firelight. It felt as though we weren't alone, and not in the way that nature surrounds you with its presence. No, this felt wrong. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, the remnants of the eerie marks in the woods still playing tricks on my mind. But every crackling twig, every rustling leaf, only made my fear grow. By morning, I was exhausted. We packed up the campsite for the last time, eager to leave. The sun was high in the sky, but the air was still, the trees strangely quiet. No birds, no rustling of animals in the underbrush. We made our way back down the mountain, the trail seeming endless as I kept looking over my shoulder. I could still feel that weight pressing down on me, the fear that something was watching. It wasn't until we were nearly back to the car that I finally allowed myself to relax. The tension slowly ebbed away, and I convinced myself that whatever we'd encountered had just been a bad experience. A wild animal, an overactive imagination. We reached the car, piled our gear in the back, and got in. As we drove away, I took one last glance at the mountains, the thick forest receding in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line, still and unmoving, watching us leave. For a split second, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but then it was gone, swallowed up by the shadows of the woods. The rest of the drive was silent. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. There was no need. The look in their eyes told me they'd felt it too. That unshakable feeling that whatever had been in those woods wasn't quite done with us. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was just a bear or something else entirely, but I know this. I will never go back to those woods again. And if I ever do, I'll be a lot more cautious about what I might find there, hiding in the shadows. I've always loved the outdoors, the feeling of being in the wilderness, away from all the noise and distractions of the city. It's just me, the trees, the wind, and the quiet. But this time, something was different. It all started when I decided to go camping alone. I hadn't done it in a while, and I figured it'd be a good break from the chaos of daily life. I picked a campsite deep in the woods, far enough away from the trails where people usually go, so I could have some solitude. The weather forecast was good, and the location was ideal for what I had in mind: peace and quiet. I packed my gear the night before: a tent, sleeping bag, some food, water, and my trusty flashlight. I made sure to bring extra batteries, as you can never be too prepared in the wilderness. When I arrived at the site, it was perfect. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. There was a small stream nearby, the sound of water running over rocks providing a soothing backdrop. I set up my tent with ease, just like I had done so many times before. As night fell, I made a small fire and sat down to enjoy the peace. I roasted some marshmallows and listened to the sounds of nature around me. The chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, and the distant call of an owl. Everything felt right. But then, just as the last embers of the fire started to die down, I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, like something brushing against the trees. I paused, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind or some animal moving through the brush. But then it came again, louder this time. A soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I stood up, straining my ears to listen. There was no breeze. The air was still. The sound continued, getting closer. My heart began to beat a little faster, but I told myself it was nothing to be afraid of. After all, this was a camping trip, not a horror movie. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the source of the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the shadows of trees and the occasional flash of a distant animal's eyes reflecting the light. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon or some other creature I wasn't familiar with. But the feeling of unease didn't fade. It grew. My instincts were telling me something was off, but I couldn't figure out what. I retreated to the safety of my tent, zipped it up, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The sounds of the forest were louder now, but the strange crunching noise had stopped. I breathed a little easier, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The fire had died down to a few glowing embers, casting eerie shadows against the walls of my tent. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard that crunching sound again, just faint enough to make me question whether I had imagined it. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. But then, in the middle of the night, it came again. Louder this time, unmistakable. It was a person, or something walking on two legs, not an animal. My blood ran cold. I held my breath, waiting, listening. The footsteps weren't hurried, but they weren't casual either. They were deliberate, as if whoever or whatever it was making sure I heard them. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The flashlight felt too far away. The zipper of my tent, the thin fabric between me and whatever was out there, seemed so fragile. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I waited for the next sound, my body tense, every muscle on edge. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. Complete silence. Minutes passed, and I dared not move. The air felt heavy, suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, my breath shallow. And just when I thought I might be imagining it all, I heard something else. A soft rustling right outside my tent. Like someone or something was standing just inches away, trying to be quiet, but not succeeding. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling. I flicked it on and pointed it toward the sound. The beam sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing. There was no one there, no animal, no shadow, nothing. But the feeling didn't go away. I couldn't explain it. My instincts were screaming at me that I wasn't alone. I couldn't stay there anymore. I wasn't sure what was out there, but I wasn't about to find out. I grabbed my things, shoved my gear hastily into my backpack, and unzipped the tent. I didn't look around. I just ran. I wasn't sure where I was going at first. I just knew I had to get away from that spot. I ran through the woods, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly ahead of me. The crunch of leaves under my feet was deafening in the silence of the night. The trees seemed to close in around me, their shadows stretching out like claws. I had no idea where I was going. The fear and adrenaline clouded my judgment, and soon, I was completely lost. I had no map, no compass, just my instincts guiding me. After what felt like hours of running, I finally stopped. Gasping for breath, I looked around. The woods were silent again, almost too quiet, but at least the feeling of being watched had faded. I knew I wasn't in the clear yet, but I felt safer. I took a few minutes to calm myself and gather my thoughts. I had to find my way back to the car. I knew I couldn't go back to the campsite, not after what had happened. But I couldn't stay here either. I needed to get out of the woods. The flashlight's beam flickered, and I cursed under my breath. I didn't have much time left with it. I started walking in the direction I thought would lead me to the road. My thoughts were racing, my heart still pounding. What had that noise been? Was it just an animal? Or something or someone else? The walk was long and exhausting. My legs burned, and my mind raced with the possibilities of what might have happened back at the campsite. But the deeper I went, the clearer it became. I wasn't sure I would ever find that campsite again. I didn't even care. Hours passed, and finally, I saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. Relief washed over me. I had made it out. The car, the road, civilization. By the time I reached my car, it was nearly dawn. I didn't bother starting the engine right away. I sat there in silence, my hands shaking, my mind replaying everything that had happened. It was real. It wasn't a dream. Whatever had happened back there, I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back into those woods. Not for a long time. I'll never forget that camping trip. It was supposed to be a weekend away from everything. Just me, the wilderness, and the sound of the wind threading through the trees. I wanted something quiet and solitary, a chance to clear my head after months of city noise and the relentless buzz of work. I'd read about the spot, an isolated stretch of forest in a state park that was barely visited, miles away from the main trails. Perfect. I packed light but carefully. My old but reliable tent, a sturdy sleeping bag, a small propane stove, plenty of water, some dehydrated meals, and basic survival gear. I double-checked everything. A whistle, a map, a compass, a fully charged power bank, and a satellite phone. I wasn't planning to take unnecessary risks. Still, being out there alone always carries some level of unpredictability. I wanted to be ready for anything. The drive took about 4 hours. It was the kind of trip where you watch the world change around you. The city gave way to suburbs, then to small towns, and finally to open stretches of road lined with tall pines. By the time I reached the dirt path leading to the trailhead, my phone had lost service. I didn't mind. That was the point. The trail wasn't well marked, but I had a GPS app on my phone to back up my map and compass. I shouldered my pack, locked the car, and started walking. The first few miles were easy enough. The trees were dense, and the forest floor was covered in a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. The air smelled rich and earthy, the way it does after a rain. Every so often, I'd hear the rustle of something small darting through the undergrowth, probably a squirrel or a bird. Felt good to be out there, away from everything. Just me and nature. I hiked for about 3 hours before I reached the spot I'd picked on the map. It was a small clearing near a shallow creek, surrounded by tall pines that swayed gently in the breeze. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent on a flat patch of ground and laying out my gear inside. The creek was close enough that I could hear the water trickling over the rocks, a soft, soothing sound that made the place feel even more peaceful. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner, sat by the small campfire I'd built, and watched the stars come out. The sky was so clear that I could see the Milky Way stretching overhead, a ribbon of light cutting through the darkness. It was beautiful. I stayed up later than I'd planned, just sitting there, listening to the forest and staring at the stars. Eventually, the chill of the night drove me into my tent, and I fell asleep almost immediately. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I followed the creek for a while, stepping carefully over rocks and fallen branches. It was slow going, but I didn't mind. The forest was alive with sound. Birds calling to each other, the distant drumming of a woodpecker, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. I saw deer tracks near the water and even spotted a small herd grazing in a meadow farther upstream. They looked up when they saw me but didn't run. I'm not sure why, but that moment stayed with me. It felt like I was part of the forest, not just passing through it. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon. I made dinner and settled in for another quiet evening by the fire. That's when I noticed the first thing that felt off. It wasn't anything big, just a small shift in the atmosphere. The forest, which had been so full of sound all day, was suddenly quiet. Not completely silent, but subdued. The birds had stopped singing, and even the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth seemed to have faded away. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had shifted, or maybe I just hadn't noticed the change until now. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. I stayed up later than I had the night before, listening to the quiet and watching the shadows deepen around my camp. Every so often, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling, the snap of a twig, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being paranoid and went to bed. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, heart pounding. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The forest was silent, the kind of deep, oppressive silence that presses against your ears. I lay there for a moment, trying to calm my breathing, and then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere outside the tent. It wasn't loud, but it was close, too close. I froze, straining to identify it. It sounded like breathing, slow, steady, deliberate. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but something about the sound didn't sit right. It was too regular, too deliberate. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle in my body tense. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, and then it stopped, just like that. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. I lay awake for the rest of the night, listening, but the sound didn't return. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I crawled out of my tent, every nerve on edge. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before. Nothing was out of place. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I'd heard. I spent the day trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. I went for another hike, kept busy with small tasks around camp, but the feeling lingered. That night, I built the fire a little bigger and kept it burning longer. I stayed up as late as I could, but eventually, exhaustion got the better of me. I crawled into my tent, telling myself that the forest was just playing tricks on me, that I'd imagine the sound. I woke again in the middle of the night. This time, there was no mistaking it. The breathing was back, louder now, more insistent. It was right outside the tent. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it might burst. I reached for my flashlight, hands shaking, and fumbled it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of the tent, but I didn't dare open the flap. The breathing continued, slow and steady, until, just like before, it stopped. When the sun came up, I made a decision. I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands trembling with every movement. The forest felt different that morning, heavier somehow. The trees seemed to press in closer, their shadows darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hike back to the car was the longest of my life. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, someone, following me. But the trail was empty, the forest as still and silent as it had been the night before. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought me to my knees. I threw my pack into the back seat, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles down the road, the forest far behind me, that I felt like I could breathe again. I don't know what was out there. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But part of me doesn't believe that. Part of me knows there was something, someone, in those woods that night. I'll never go back to find out. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out there, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of the wind brushing through the leaves. No cars, no notifications, just me and the raw, unfiltered wilderness. It's the kind of peace I don't find anywhere else. That's why, last summer, I decided to take a solo trip deep into the woods of a national forest I'd never been to before. I'd heard it was remote, quiet, and perfect for a weekend away from everything. The plan was simple. Drive up on Friday, hike a few miles in, find a good spot to set up camp, and spend a couple of days exploring the trails before heading back Sunday evening. I packed light but smart. Tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, food, water, a first aid kit, and my trusty multi-tool. I even brought a map of the area, marked with the trails and a couple of streams I could use to refill my water if needed. I thought I was prepared for anything. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, the kind of drive where you're half listening to the radio but mostly just watching the scenery change as you get farther from the city. By the time I parked, it was already late afternoon. The air smelled fresh, the kind of fresh you only get when you're miles away from any civilization. I slung my pack over my shoulders, locked the car, and started down the trail. The first couple of miles were easy. The path was well-trodden, and the markers were clear. It felt good to stretch my legs after sitting in the car for so long. I passed a couple of hikers heading back toward the parking lot, and we exchanged polite nods. After that, I didn't see anyone. The forest started to feel more alive the deeper I went. Birds chirped, insects buzzed, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush reminded me that I wasn't alone out here, even if I couldn't see what was sharing the woods with me. Around 6 o'clock, I found a good spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing just off the trail, with enough flat ground for my tent and a few rocks I could use as a makeshift fire ring. There was even a fallen log nearby that looked perfect for sitting on. I pitched my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and gathered some firewood before the sun dipped too low. By the time the sky started turning shades of orange and pink, I had a small fire going and a pot of water heating up for dinner. As I ate, the forest around me grew darker and quieter. The chirping of birds gave way to the rhythmic hum of crickets, and the occasional distant hoot of an owl reminded me just how far I was from anyone else. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that's almost unnerving when you're used to constant noise and motion. I sat by the fire for a while, staring into the flames and listening to the night. When the fire burned down to embers, I crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and drifted off to sleep. I woke up once during the night. It was probably around 2 or 3 in the morning. The fire was long dead, and the only light came from the faint sliver of moon peeking through the trees. I lay there for a moment, trying to figure out what had woken me up. At first, I didn't hear anything unusual, just the crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But then I heard it, a faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking underfoot. It was quiet, but unmistakable. I held my breath, straining to hear more. A few seconds later, there it was again, closer this time. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a raccoon rummaging around, but something about it felt off. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness as I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. I scanned the clearing, moving the light slowly from side to side. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I told myself I was being paranoid and went back to bed, but it took a long time to fall asleep again. The next morning, I shook off the unease from the night before. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and I had a full day of exploring ahead of me. After a quick breakfast, I packed a smaller day pack with water, snacks, and my map, and set off down the trail. The forest was beautiful, dense with towering trees and patches of wildflowers. I followed the trail for a couple of miles before branching off onto a smaller, less traveled path that wasn't marked on the map. It looked like it had been used recently. The grass was flattened, and there were faint boot prints in the dirt. I followed the path for what must have been an hour, maybe more. It wound through the trees, crossing a shallow stream and climbing up a small ridge. The view from the top was incredible. I could see the forest stretching out for miles, a sea of green under a bright blue sky. I sat there for a while, drinking water and enjoying the quiet. But as I started back down the ridge, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There, in the dirt, were my footprints from earlier. But right next to them was another set of prints. They were larger than mine, and the tread pattern didn't match my boots. Someone had followed me. I froze, my eyes darting around the forest. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself that it was probably just another hiker who'd happened to take the same path. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By the time I made it back to my campsite, the sun was starting to set. I tried to act normal, going through the motions of building a fire and cooking dinner, but my nerves were on edge. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves had me whipping my head around, my heart pounding. I didn't see anything unusual, but the feeling of being watched never went away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent, staring at the ceiling and listening to every sound. Around midnight, I heard it again, the snapping of twigs, closer this time, then a rustling, like someone or something moving through the underbrush. I grabbed my flashlight and my multi-tool, my hands trembling as I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The clearing was empty, but the sounds continued, moving around the perimeter of my campsite. Whoever or whatever it was, they were circling me. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, my flashlight pointed at the darkness, my ears straining for any sign of movement. Eventually, the sound stopped, but I didn't dare go back to sleep. I sat by the dead fire, clutching my multi-tool and jumping at every little noise until the sky started to lighten with the first hints of dawn. As soon as there was enough light to see, I packed up my gear and started back toward the trailhead. I didn't bother with breakfast or even trying to enjoy the morning. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back felt like it took forever. Every step, I expected to hear footsteps behind me or see someone step out from the trees. But the trail stayed empty. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. I tossed my pack into the back seat, climbed in, and locked the doors before starting the engine. As I pulled out onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching me leave. But there was nothing. I don't know who or what was out there that weekend. Maybe it was just another hiker, someone curious or harmless who didn't realize how much they were scaring me. Or maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I've never felt fear like that before, and I've never gone camping alone again. I never thought a simple weekend camping trip could go so wrong. I had been camping before plenty of times. It wasn't anything new to me. Just me, my backpack, my tent, and the quiet isolation of the woods. It was supposed to be peaceful. It was supposed to be simple. But this time, it wasn't. I had driven out to a spot I'd researched online, somewhere in the dense forest of a national park about 2 hours from home. The reviews mentioned it being quiet, not too crowded, and perfect for anyone looking to get away from the noise of daily life. That's exactly what I wanted. I packed up everything I'd need: a lightweight tent, sleeping bag, a portable stove, plenty of food and water, and headed out early Saturday morning. The trailhead parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived, just 1 or 2 cars parked under the tall pines. I liked it that way. Less noise, less chance of running into people. I checked my map, double-checked my gear, and started hiking. The trail was well marked at first, winding through a mix of dense forest and open clearings. The sun filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled patterns of light on the ground. I felt at ease, the stress of the week already melting away with each step deeper into the wilderness. After about 3 miles, I reached a fork in the trail. To the right was the main path, leading to a designated camping area a few more miles in. To the left was a narrower, less trodden path that didn't seem to be marked on the map. I hesitated for a moment, considering my options. The main path would be safer, but it also meant a higher chance of running into other campers. The narrow path, though less predictable, seemed like it might lead to a quieter spot. I decided to take it. Something about the idea of being truly alone appealed to me. The trail became rougher the further I went. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and rocks, and I had to watch my step carefully. The forest seemed to grow denser here, the trees pressing in closer and the light dimming. After about another mile, I came across a small clearing, just large enough for my tent and a small fire pit. It felt secluded, far enough from the main trail that I wouldn't be disturbed, but not so far that I couldn't find my way back. I set up camp, pitching my tent on a flat patch of ground and gathering some wood for a fire. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove and sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the flames, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the occasional call of a bird or distant rustle of something moving in the underbrush. I felt completely alone, and it was exactly what I had hoped for. But as the night fell and the fire burned down to embers, the woods around me seemed to change. The stillness felt heavier, almost oppressive. The sounds of the forest, so soothing during the day, now seemed sharper, more deliberate. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves felt closer, like something was moving just out of sight. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was simply unused to being so far from civilization. I forced myself to crawl into my tent and try to sleep. The first night passed uneventfully, though I slept poorly. Every little noise outside the thin walls of my tent kept me on edge. I woke up early, the first light of dawn barely filtering through the trees. I made coffee, packed up my gear, and decided to explore a bit before heading back to the main trail. There was something about the area that intrigued me, despite the unease I had felt the night before. I left most of my gear at the campsite, taking only a small day pack with water, snacks, and my map. I figured I'd be back in a couple of hours. The narrow trail continued deeper into the forest, winding through dense thickets and up gentle slopes. I marked my path as I went, tying small pieces of bright orange tape to branches to ensure I wouldn't get lost. The air was cooler here, the canopy above so thick that barely any sunlight reached the forest floor. It was beautiful in a wild and untamed way. After about an hour of walking, I came across something strange. The trail seemed to disappear into a steep ravine, its sides lined with jagged rocks and dense undergrowth. At the bottom, I could see a small stream trickling through the shadows. There was no clear way to cross, and the idea of climbing down and back up the other side seemed risky. As I stood there, considering my options, I felt a prickle of unease again. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I decided to turn back, retracing my steps carefully. But as I walked, I realized something was off. The pieces of orange tape I had tied to mark my path were gone. Not broken or fallen, but completely gone, as if someone had removed them. My stomach twisted. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I must have made a mistake, that I had missed a turn or tied the markers too loosely. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Panic began to creep in as I searched for any sign of the trail back to my campsite. The forest felt alien now, the once familiar path seeming to shift and change around me. I checked my map, but it was useless without the trail markers. The GPS on my phone showed nothing but a blank screen, the dense canopy above blocking any signal. I was lost. Hours passed as I wandered, my sense of direction growing more and more confused. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, the shadows stretching longer and darker. I tried to stay calm, to think logically, but the fear was growing. I had enough supplies to last the night, but the idea of spending another night alone in this increasingly hostile forest filled me with dread. As the light faded, I stumbled across a small clearing. It wasn't my campsite, but it was flat and open enough to set up for the night. I pitched my tent quickly, my hands shaking, and gathered some wood for a fire. The flames brought little comfort this time, their light only emphasizing the darkness pressing in around me. I ate a cold meal, too anxious to bother with cooking, and sat by the fire, listening. Every sound seemed amplified now, every rustle or crack a potential threat. At some point during the night, I must have fallen asleep, though I don't remember when. I woke to the sound of something moving outside my tent, close enough that I could hear the crunch of leaves and the snap of twigs. My heart pounded as I held my breath, straining to listen. It didn't sound like an animal. The steps were too deliberate, too heavy. It circled the tent once, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. I stayed frozen, clutching the small camping knife I kept by my sleeping bag, until the first light of dawn began to seep through the tent walls. When I finally dared to look outside, there was nothing there. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something or someone had been out there. I didn't waste any time packing up. I needed to get out of there, to find my way back to the main trail and leave the forest behind. But no matter which direction I chose, the trees all looked the same, the paths indistinguishable from one another. It felt like the forest was deliberately keeping me in, its dense foliage and twisting trails forming a maze with no exit. By midday, I was exhausted and disoriented, my water running low. The forest seemed to close in around me, the once beautiful scenery now oppressive and menacing. I was starting to lose hope when I heard it, the faint sound of running water. It was the first sound I'd heard all day that wasn't my own footsteps or the occasional bird call. I followed it, desperate for some sign of civilization or at least a landmark. The stream led me to a larger clearing, where I found something that both relieved and terrified me. A weathered wooden sign, half hidden by overgrown bushes. The letters were faded, but I could just make out the words, "Trailhead," and an arrow pointing left. I wasn't far from safety after all, but the relief was short-lived. Beside the sign, partially hidden in the tall grass, was a backpack. It was torn and weathered, as if it had been there for months. The contents were scattered, the fabric stained with something dark and dried. My stomach churned as I realized what it meant. Someone else had been lost here, and they hadn't made it out. I didn't stop to think. I followed the arrow, forcing myself to move despite the fear clawing at my mind. The trail was faint, barely more than a game trail, but it was something. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, ignoring the growing sense of being watched. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew better. Running would only lead to more mistakes, more chances to lose the trail. When I finally saw the parking lot, the sight felt unreal, like a mirage. My car was still there, untouched, the only vehicle left. I didn't waste a second. I threw my gear into the back seat and drove away, not stopping until I was miles from the forest. I never reported what I found. I couldn't bring myself to relive it, to explain what had happened to anyone. I still don't know who or what was out there with me, but I've never gone camping alone again, and I never will. I never considered myself much of a camper, but I always liked the idea of disconnecting from everything, leaving behind the constant buzz of phones, emails, and social media. So, when my friend Tim lent me his gear and suggested I try a solo camping trip, I decided to give it a shot. I planned meticulously, poring over maps, reading forums, and making lists of essentials. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was something I felt prepared for. At least I thought I was. I chose a spot deep in the national forest, about a 4-hour hike from the nearest trailhead. It was far enough to feel secluded, but not so remote that I'd be completely off the grid. The route was marked as moderate, and with decent weather predicted, I figured I could handle it. I packed food, water, a first aid kit, a small tent, a sleeping bag, and a headlamp. Tim's gear, a reliable pack and lightweight stove, completed my setup. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. I parked my car, double-checked my map, and set out around mid-morning. The trail was well-maintained, winding through dense forest with occasional clearings that offered views of rolling hills and distant peaks. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. It felt good to be away from the noise of the city. By early afternoon, I reached a small stream, my halfway point. I stopped to refill my water bottle using the filter Tim had lent me and ate a quick lunch of trail mix and an energy bar. The sound of the water was soothing, and for a moment, I thought about just staying there. But the spot I had chosen to camp was supposed to be near a small lake, and I was eager to see it. The last leg of the hike was harder than I expected. The trail grew steeper and narrower, and the trees closed in, blocking out much of the sunlight. I noticed the silence more here. The occasional bird call or rustle of leaves had been comforting earlier, but now the quiet felt heavy. I kept moving, focusing on each step, until finally, I saw the lake through the trees. It wasn't large, maybe a couple 100 feet across, but the water was clear and still, reflecting the dark green of the surrounding forest. It was beautiful. I found a flat spot a short distance from the lake and set up my tent. The process took longer than it should have. The stakes didn't want to go into the rocky ground, and I realized I'd forgotten how to adjust the rainfly. By the time everything was in place, the sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the clearing. I gathered some wood for a small fire, cooked a quick meal, and sat watching the flames as the sky turned from orange to deep blue. The first night went smoothly. I woke up once to the sound of something moving outside the tent, but it was probably just a raccoon or a deer. I fell back asleep quickly and woke up the next morning feeling refreshed. After breakfast, I spent the day exploring the area, following animal trails, and sitting by the lake. The sense of solitude was exhilarating, but as the day wore on, I started to feel a bit uneasy. It wasn't anything specific, just a growing awareness of how alone I was. That night, the unease grew stronger. I kept hearing faint noises, branches snapping, something splashing in the lake. I told myself it was just wildlife, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stayed up later than I planned, shining my headlamp into the trees whenever I heard something. The beam of light revealed nothing but shadows and swaying branches. Finally, I convinced myself to lie down and try to sleep. I woke up abruptly sometime in the middle of the night. The air inside the tent felt cold, and I could hear the wind picking up outside. Then I heard it, a distinct sound, different from the rustling of leaves or the creaking of trees. It was a soft, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was faint, but it was there. My heart raced as I strained to listen. The sound moved closer, then stopped. I held my breath, gripping the knife I kept in my pack. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound faded away. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside cautiously. The forest looked the same as it had the day before, peaceful, untouched. There were no signs of anyone else. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the trailhead. Packing up took longer than usual. My hands were shaking, and I kept stopping to listen for any sounds. The hike back was grueling. Every noise, the rustle of leaves, the call of a bird, made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. The trail that had felt welcoming 2 days ago now seemed oppressive, the trees closing in on all sides. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so strong I almost laughed. I threw my pack into the back seat, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles down the road that I realized my hands were still trembling. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Maybe it was just my imagination, heightened by being alone in an unfamiliar place. Maybe the footsteps were just an animal. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, watching me. I haven't been camping since. It had been a long day of driving. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when I turned onto a narrow, winding road that promised nothing but empty fields and darkened woods. The GPS had warned me that I was entering a remote area, but I didn't think much of it. After all, I was just passing through to get to a small town on the other side. A town I'd never visited before but had heard about in passing. I was getting tired, and the faint flicker of my car's dashboard lights reflected the growing weariness in my eyes. I didn't even mind that the road was slowly deteriorating. It wasn't the smoothest route, but it wasn't unbearable either. The road twisted and turned, disappearing into the horizon at every bend, with only the occasional light from a distant farmhouse piercing the darkness. A part of me felt like I was driving into nowhere, the kind of nowhere where people go to disappear, where the world seems to slip out of focus, and you feel like you're the only one left. The trees on either side of the road grew taller, their branches intertwining to create a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. The air outside was cool, but not enough to warrant rolling down the windows. I kept the radio off, too, not wanting anything to break the eerie silence that seemed to grow as I drove deeper into the woods. I hadn't seen another car for miles. The only sign of life had been the occasional farmhouse, each one looking more abandoned than the last. The lights in their windows flickered, or sometimes didn't exist at all, their dark silhouettes standing as sentinels against the backdrop of an ever-encroaching night. I wasn't used to driving like this in such an isolated place, but there was no turning back now. My mind wandered, and for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a feeling I could describe easily, nothing overt or obvious, but something about the stillness of the place, the heavy weight of the silence pressing in, made me uneasy. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see headlights approaching behind me, but each time, the rear view was as empty as the road ahead. As I rounded another curve, my headlights swept over a sign that had been partially obscured by overgrown vines. It looked like the sign had been abandoned, old and worn, as if it hadn't been touched in years. The name on the sign was barely legible, but I could make out the word Halton, which must have been the name of the small town I was heading toward. I was nearly halfway through the woods when I noticed something unusual. A light up ahead. It wasn't the bright white beam of a car's headlights, but rather a soft, flickering glow. At first, I thought it was just the light from a house, but the longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't. It wasn't like a porch light or even a street lamp. It was different, pulsed in and out, like it was trying to stay alive but failing. I slowed down, curiosity gnawing at me. I come this far, and a small part of me thought I should check it out. The other part, however, screamed for me to turn around and get out of there. I hesitated. It wasn't the kind of place you pulled over for curiosity. Not in the middle of nowhere like this. But before I could make up my mind, the glow disappeared. Just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. A strange sort of relief washed over me. Whatever it had been, I wasn't going to find out. But then something strange happened. In the spot where the light had been, a shadow moved. I blinked, twice, but the shadow remained. It was too large to be a tree, too defined to be a trick of the light. Something or someone was out there watching. My heart began to race as I pressed my foot harder on the gas. The road ahead seemed to stretch further into darkness. The trees were pressing in tighter now, their branches seeming to reach for me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, my instincts screaming at me to get out of there. As I drove faster, my eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The empty stretch of road had now taken on a menacing quality, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The unease that had been simmering beneath the surface of my mind was now a full-blown panic. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild in the dark. But the feeling persisted. Couldn't shake it. I was too far into the woods to turn around now, and the thought of retracing my path through those dense trees only made my anxiety worse. I drove faster. The glow came back, flickering from behind the trees once again. Only this time it didn't disappear. It grew brighter, almost as if it was guiding me forward. Suddenly, the road took an unexpected turn, and I had no choice but to swerve to avoid driving straight into a steep drop-off. I slammed my hands against the steering wheel and braced myself for the worst, but somehow I managed to keep control. The tires screeched on the gravel, and my car slid sideways, but I regained my grip and veered back onto the road. I didn't dare look back. Whatever was out there, whatever was following me, could have caught up by now. I wasn't taking any chances. As I turned another corner, the headlights of my car illuminated a large, abandoned building in the distance. The flickering light seemed to be coming from there. A warehouse of some kind, long past its prime. The structure looked to be crumbling, with large windows boarded up and the door hanging half open. It was the kind of place you'd see in a horror movie, isolated, dark, and forgotten. I was about to pass it, but something in my gut told me I needed to stop. I didn't know why. Maybe it was the need to find out what that light was, or maybe it was a deeper, more instinctive pull. Something urged me to park and get out. I pulled over, the car engine's hum now replaced with an unsettling silence. The building loomed ahead of me, a monolith against the backdrop of the night sky. I sat in the car for a moment, staring at it, weighing my options. There was no turning back now. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the car and walked toward the building. Each step felt heavier than the last. As I got closer, the strange flickering light became clearer. It was coming from inside the building. I could see it now, moving across the walls in rapid flashes, almost like a strobe light. I reached the entrance, hesitated for a moment, and then stepped inside. I'm not sure what drew me to the backroads that day. Maybe it was the promise of a shortcut or just my stubborn need to avoid the crowded highways. Whatever the reason, I found myself in the middle of nowhere, driving along a 2-lane road that cut through miles of barren fields and dense woods. The GPS had lost signal about an hour ago, and I was relying on a printed map that felt like a relic from another time. The road was cracked, weeds poking through the asphalt, and there wasn't a single house or car in sight. It was just me, my old sedan, and the endless expanse of emptiness. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the road. I hadn't seen another vehicle for hours, and the isolation was beginning to gnaw at me. I kept telling myself that I'd reach a town soon, but the miles dragged on, and the road just seemed to stretch further into nowhere. My fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty. I cursed myself for not filling up at the last gas station, but it had been miles ago, and I hadn't thought it would be an issue. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, I spotted a faint glimmer of light ahead. It was small, maybe just a reflection, but it was enough to spark a sliver of hope. I pressed on, the tires humming on the rough pavement. The light grew brighter as I approached, revealing an old, dilapidated gas station. The sign above the building was weathered and illegible, and the single pump looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Still, it was something. I pulled up next to the pump and stepped out of the car. The air was cold and smelled faintly of damp earth. The station's windows were dark, and there was no sign of anyone inside. A single bulb hung above the door, flickering weakly. I tried the pump, but nothing happened. No gas, no noise, just the hollow clunk of a machine long out of service. Frustrated, I walked toward the door of the station. The wooden boards creaked under my weight as I stepped onto the porch. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I tried the handle and it opened with a groan. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. Shelves lined the walls, but they were mostly empty, save for a few rusted cans and faded boxes. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the small space. No response. I debated whether to look around more or head back to the car. The idea of spending the night in the car didn't sit well with me, especially in a place like this. I decided to search for anything that might help. Phone, a map, anything. I moved cautiously through the station, the floorboards creaking with each step. In the back corner, I spotted an old payphone. My heart leapt as I rushed over, but the receiver was gone, and the wires had been ripped out. Useless. As I turned to leave, I noticed a door behind the counter. It was slightly ajar, revealing a staircase leading downward. A faint smell wafted up from the darkness, a mix of damp concrete and something metallic. Curiosity wrestled with caution. I told myself it wasn't worth it, but something about the open door felt like an invitation I couldn't ignore. I descended the stairs slowly, the weak light from above barely illuminating the steps. The air grew colder with each step, and my breathing sounded loud in the confined space. At the bottom, I found myself in a small concrete room. There was a table in the center with various tools scattered across it. Wrenches, screwdrivers, and a hammer stained with something dark. Against the far wall was a row of shelves filled with jars. I stepped closer and immediately regretted it. The jars contained what looked like preserved animals, their distorted forms floating in a murky liquid. A shiver ran down my spine. I turned to leave, but a sound stopped me. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like the scrape of something against concrete. I froze, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. My heart pounded as I realized it was coming from the staircase. I bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time. As I reached the top, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. I leaned against the counter, trying to catch my breath. The station was silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I ran back to my car and turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered but didn't start. I tried again, but the same thing happened. Panic set in as I realized I was stranded. I grabbed my phone, but there was still no signal. I looked around, desperate for any sign of help. That's when I noticed the faint glow of a fire in the distance. It was coming from a small clearing just beyond the station. With no other options, I decided to investigate. I grabbed the flashlight from my glove compartment and started walking toward the light. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound being the crunch of gravel under my boots. As I got closer, I saw that the fire was in a metal drum, surrounded by a few folding chairs. The chairs were empty, but the fire was still burning, as if someone had just been there. I called out, but there was no response. I looked around, shining my flashlight into the surrounding woods. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I saw were trees and shadows. I turned back to the fire and noticed something on the ground near the chairs. It was a notebook partially burned at the edges. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. Most of the writing was illegible, but one word stood out, scrawled over and over, "Run." My stomach dropped. I turned back toward the gas station, intending to get back to my car, but I froze in my tracks. Standing in the doorway of the station was a figure. It was too dark to make out any details, but they were tall and unmoving. My flashlight beam wavered as my hand trembled. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I took a step back, then another, until I was sure I could make a run for it. I turned and sprinted toward the woods. Branches whipped against my face, and the uneven ground threatened to trip me with every step. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, driven by pure adrenaline and fear. Eventually, I stumbled into a small clearing. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like jelly. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. As I sat there, trying to gather my thoughts, I realized I could hear water, a faint trickle like a stream or a creek. I followed the sound, hoping it might lead me to a road or a house. The stream was shallow, but it wound through the woods like a natural path. I followed it for what felt like hours, my flashlight growing dimmer with each passing minute. Just as the flashlight flickered out completely, I saw a structure in the distance. It was a small cabin, its windows glowing with warm light. Relief washed over me as I approached. I knocked on the door, my knuckles raw and trembling. After a moment, the door creaked open, and an older man stood there, his face lined with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice steady and calm. I nodded, unable to find the words. He ushered me inside and offered me a chair by the fire. The warmth was a welcome relief, and I began to explain what had happened. The man listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You're lucky you made it out of there," he said. "That place has been abandoned for years. People say strange things happen out there, but no one really knows for sure." I stayed at the cabin until morning, when the man offered to drive me to the nearest town. As we drove away, I couldn't help but look back at the woods. They seemed calm and ordinary in the daylight, but I knew better. Whatever had happened out there, it was real, and I'd carry it with me for the rest of my life. I never expected a weekend getaway to turn into something I'd never be able to forget. I'm not one for horror stories or anything supernatural, but something happened that weekend that rattled me to my core. And it all started with a cabin, one that I'd found online, tucked away in the woods. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat.
No distractions.
No city noise, just me, my thoughts, and nature. The perfect escape from the grind. The cabin was small, rustic, the kind of place that promised a full immersion in nature. It wasn't far from town, just a couple of hours, tucked off the beaten path, hidden among tall trees and winding dirt roads. The journey up wasn't as smooth as I'd hoped. The GPS led me down a bumpy dirt road that grew narrower and rougher the further I went. The trees around me seemed to close in, their towering trunks like silent sentinels, blocking out much of the sun. It was peaceful at first. I loved how the forest seemed to swallow all the noise of the world. But as the hours passed, I began to wonder if I'd gone too far off course. I kept driving, past isolated patches of trees, until I saw the cabin. It was a small, weather-beaten building made of dark wood, sitting alone among a small clearing. At first glance, it looked quaint, exactly like the pictures on the website. A porch with a couple of old rocking chairs, a small chimney puffing out a faint trail of smoke, and a backdrop of dense woods. I parked the car and stepped out into the quiet. The air was fresh but cool, and the silence was almost suffocating. There were no birds chirping, no animals scurrying about. Nothing, just the wind whispering through the leaves. It struck me as odd but not unsettling. I chalked it up to being deep in the woods. I grabbed my bag from the car and made my way to the front door. The key was hidden under a small rock beside the door, just like the instructions had said. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The inside of the cabin was as rustic as the outside, with a heavy, earthy smell that filled my nostrils. Old wooden beams stretched across the ceiling, and the furniture was mismatched but comfortable. A couch, a couple of armchairs, a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen area were all in place. A large window in the living room overlooked the woods, and I couldn't help but feel a slight sense of unease as I gazed at the dense forest outside. I dropped my bag and settled in, unpacking my things and making myself a cup of coffee. There was a note on the kitchen counter from the property owner, welcoming me and giving a few instructions about the cabin. The message was short and friendly, but it didn't mention much about the surrounding area. No directions to nearby towns, no suggestions for things to do. Just a simple enjoy your stay and a list of emergency contact numbers. I didn't think much of it and decided to take a walk around the property. The woods surrounding the cabin seemed almost impenetrable. The trees were thick, their trunks gnarled and twisted in ways that made me feel like they were watching me. It was strange how the forest felt so alive, but not in a welcoming way. The air had a damp chill, and the silence hung heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed, though I saw nothing but trees and leaves. I returned to the cabin, deciding to settle in for the night. It was just me, alone in this isolated spot. There was no TV, no phone signal, no internet, just the fire crackling in the fireplace and the quiet outside. It should have been peaceful. It should have been exactly what I wanted. But as the night drew on, I started to hear things. It started with a faint tapping sound. Soft at first, like someone was knocking on the door. But when I checked, the porch was empty. The woods outside were still. There was nothing but the wind, but even that seemed unnaturally quiet. I shrugged it off as a branch brushing against the cabin, something harmless. The tapping continued throughout the evening, becoming more distinct as the hours passed. It sounded like it was coming from the walls, the roof, or perhaps somewhere underneath the cabin. I tried to ignore it, but every now and then, I'd hear a faint scrape, followed by that same gentle knock. It was driving me mad. Around midnight, I heard a louder sound. It came from outside this time, something heavy scraping against the wood. I jumped up from my seat, my heart racing. I didn't want to go out there. I didn't want to look, but I had to know what it was. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cold, and the silence was even more oppressive than before. I shone the flashlight into the woods, scanning the darkness. The beam caught only trees and the occasional rustling of leaves. There was nothing except the sound. The unmistakable scraping sound, like something large was dragging along the ground. It was coming from the far side of the cabin, from the tree line. I felt my pulse quicken. The woods seemed to close in, and for the first time I felt real fear. I decided to get inside. Fast. I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut, hoping that whatever it was would stay outside. The sound continued for a few more minutes before it finally stopped. But then, something else happened. I could feel it, a presence, like someone was standing just outside the cabin, watching me through the walls. I tried to convince myself that it was just my nerves. After all, I was alone in the middle of nowhere. My mind was probably playing tricks on me. But then I heard something even worse. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They circled around the cabin, scraping across the wooden floor, getting closer to the door. I held my breath, my body frozen with fear. The steps stopped right outside the window next to the door. I could see nothing, but I could hear the slow, steady rhythm of the footsteps. Couldn't move, couldn't scream. My hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight, but I knew it wouldn't help. Whatever was outside wasn't something I could fight. The steps moved around the cabin again, then stopped. For a moment, there was absolute silence. And then nothing. The footsteps disappeared. I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring at the walls, too scared to sleep, too scared to move. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I dozed off in the armchair, my eyes darting open every few minutes, checking the windows, the door. But nothing came back. When morning came, I was exhausted but relieved. The sun had risen, and the world seemed normal again.
No footsteps, no strange sounds.
It was as if the night's events had been a dream, but I knew it wasn't. I felt it. I'd heard it. I didn't want to leave the cabin. I didn't want to drive away from whatever that thing was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting for me to leave so it could follow me. After packing my things in a rush, I drove back down the same winding road, the trees watching me as I left. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if I was just overtired, or if there was something out there in those woods. All I know is that I won't be going back to that cabin. Not now. Not ever. The woods may have been quiet when I left, but I could feel it. Something was still there, waiting for the next person to come. The silence in the middle of nowhere was suffocating. I'd been driving for hours, the sun long set, the road ahead lit only by the faint beams from my headlights. My car hummed steadily, and the tires on the cracked asphalt made a constant sound. It was the only thing breaking the eerie quiet of the vast, empty countryside. Around me, nothing but fields stretched in every direction. No signs of life, no houses,
No lights.
felt like I was the last person on Earth. I hadn't planned on being out here. The road I was on wasn't even on my map. I was just trying to get back home after visiting a friend, and somewhere along the way, I took a wrong turn, and here I was. There had been no towns, no exits, just miles of nothing. I wasn't scared. I mean, not exactly. I was a little unsettled, sure, but more out of frustration than fear. The thought of having to find a place to turn around and retrace my steps didn't sit well with me. But I kept going. The GPS on my phone was dead. No surprise there. I hadn't seen a signal for miles, and I didn't even know which direction I was going anymore. The radio was filled with static. No one was out here. No one at all. It wasn't like I hadn't been on back roads before, but this felt different. More isolating. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the task at hand. Just keep driving, just get out of this place. Then I saw the lights. They were small at first, just a faint flicker ahead, probably a house in the distance. I felt a small sense of relief. Maybe there was someone out here, someone to ask for directions. Maybe I could even stretch my legs and get a bit of a break from the monotonous drive. As I neared, the lights didn't get any brighter. They didn't seem like the kind of lights you would see coming from a house or a gas station. Instead, they were dim and odd, faint, yellowish glows that seemed to flicker and pulse unnaturally. I slowed the car down as I got closer, instinct telling me to be cautious. The road up ahead was no longer a smooth stretch of blacktop, but a rough, gravel path that looked like it had seen better days. The flickering lights were coming from some kind of shack or small building off the side of the road. There was no sign indicating it was a business or a home, just a decrepit structure, barely visible through the fog that had begun to roll in. The building itself was old, the wood dark and cracked, and I could barely make out the outline of what looked like an old pickup truck parked nearby. It didn't make sense, but I couldn't just keep driving without checking. So, I pulled off the road and parked by the edge of the gravel path, shutting off my engine. The hum of the car died down immediately, leaving the world even quieter. I could hear the distant rustling of the wind and, in the background, what I swore was the faintest sound of someone, moving inside the shack. I hesitated for a moment, sitting there in the car with my hand still on the door handle. I could leave. It was probably safer to just keep going until I found a real town. But curiosity gnawed at me. Something told me that if I didn't at least see what was going on, I might regret it later. So, I stepped out of the car and walked toward the building. As I moved closer, I could hear the creaking of the wooden structure and the sound of someone humming. A low, eerie tune that seemed to echo in the cold air. It was a man's voice, but it didn't sound human in the way I expected. It was like someone trying to remember how to hum, but failing miserably. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I pushed through. The door to the shack was ajar, just enough to let a sliver of light escape from the inside. I stopped just before the threshold and called out, "Hello." My voice cracked in the stillness. No response, just the humming. I pushed the door open slightly more and peered inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was a mix of something rotting and a faint scent of metal, like old rusted tools. My stomach churned, and I stepped back, trying not to breathe too deeply. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There was a man sitting at a small, rickety table in the center of the room. His back was to me, but I could see him clearly now. He was hunched over, his hands moving as if he was working on something, though I couldn't tell what. His clothes were torn and tattered, and his hair, long and greasy, hung down over his face. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't even move, but he kept humming that strange, off-key melody, louder now, like he didn't care I was standing there. I wasn't sure what to do. My instinct told me to leave, but I had to know what he was doing. Why was he here in the middle of nowhere in a shack like this? I stepped forward, and the floorboard creaked loudly under my foot. That's when he stopped humming. I froze. The silence that followed was worse than anything. The air felt thick, oppressive, like something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Slowly, the man turned his head toward me, but he didn't stand. He just looked over his shoulder with eyes that seemed too wide, too intense. For a moment, neither of us moved. It was like we were frozen in time. His gaze was unsettling, almost too calm for someone who looked like they hadn't seen another soul in years. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice flat, without emotion. I shook my head, feeling the tight knot in my throat. "I'm just lost. I need directions." The man didn't respond. Instead, he stood up slowly and walked toward a table cluttered with all sorts of strange, discarded objects. Old papers, empty cans, and what looked like broken electronics. He muttered something under his breath, though it didn't sound like words, just sounds. Then he stopped at the edge of the table, picked something up, and turned back to face me. It was a knife, a long, sharp-looking knife, and his hand gripped it too tightly, like he was about to do something with it. I immediately took a step back. My mind raced as I thought about what to do. Something was wrong here. This man wasn't right. The fear I'd been suppressing hit me all at once. I turned to leave, but the man stepped toward me, blocking the door. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice colder now. I didn't answer, couldn't. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized how much danger I was in. The door was the only way out, but it was blocked. The man kept staring at me, his eyes like two dark holes in his face. There was something about him, something off, like he wasn't quite human anymore. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it deep in my gut. I turned on my heel and ran for the window at the back of the shack, the glass rattling as I shoved it open. The cold night air hit me in the face, and I jumped out onto the ground, scrambling to my feet as fast as I could. Behind me, I heard the sound of the man's boots hitting the floor, but I didn't stop. I ran as hard as I could, not daring to look back. It felt like forever before I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys, finally managing to unlock the door. I jumped in, started the engine, and peeled out of there, my heart still racing. In the rearview mirror, I saw the shack disappear into the distance, swallowed up by the darkness. I didn't look back. I was halfway through my cross-country road trip when I found myself on an isolated stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. The road stretched ahead endlessly, flanked by nothing but flat, barren land as far as the eye could see. The sun was setting, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, but the beauty of it was lost on me. I was running low on gas, and there hadn't been a service station or a single sign of civilization for miles. My phone had no signal, and I was beginning to feel the creeping unease that comes with being utterly alone. I cursed myself for not filling up earlier when I had the chance. The last town I passed through was hours ago. A blink-and-you'll-miss-it place with a single diner and a gas pump that looked like it hadn't been used since the 60s. I had waved it off, confident that I'd find a bigger station up ahead. Now, I was regretting that decision with every mile I drove. The car's gas gauge dipped into the red zone, and I knew I couldn't keep going much longer. I scanned the horizon for any sign of life, but all I saw was the endless, empty expanse of dirt and scrub. The road was eerily quiet. I hadn't seen another car in hours. It was as if I was the only person left in the world. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, plunging the landscape into darkness, I spotted something in the distance. At first, I thought it was a mirage, a trick of my desperate mind, but as I got closer, I saw it was a building. It looked like an old gas station, its faded sign barely legible in the dim light. Relief flooded through me, and I pulled in, my tires crunching on the gravel. The place was a relic from another era, with peeling paint and a single rusty pump. A flickering neon light buzzed above the door, casting an eerie glow over the entrance. The windows were dark, and I couldn't tell if anyone was inside. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the silence. The only sound was the ticking of my car's cooling engine. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. The stillness was unnerving. The station was surrounded by nothing but open land, and the vastness of it made me feel exposed. I walked to the door and pushed it open, the creak of the hinges echoing in the empty space. Inside, the place was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The shelves were mostly empty, lined with dusty cans and faded boxes of snacks. A counter stood at the far end, with an old cash register and a bell that looked like it hadn't been rung in years. There was no sign of anyone. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. No answer. I rang the bell, the sharp ding making me flinch. Still nothing. I looked around, feeling a growing sense of unease. There was a door behind the counter, slightly ajar, leading to what I assumed was a back room. I hesitated. Something about this place didn't feel right, but I didn't have much choice. I needed gas, and this was my only option. I walked back outside to check the pump. It was one of those old, manual ones with a crank. There was no card reader, just a faded sign that said, "Pay inside." I tried the nozzle, but nothing happened. The pump was dry. Frustration bubbled up inside me, and I slammed the nozzle back into its holder. Now what? As I stood there, trying to figure out my next move, I heard a noise. It was faint, barely audible over the silence, but it was there. A soft shuffling sound, like someone moving around inside the station. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe there was someone here after all. Maybe they could help me. I went back inside, the door creaking again as I pushed it open. "Hello," I called out, louder this time. The shuffling sound stopped. I walked to the counter and peered into the back room. It was dark, but I could make out the outline of shelves and boxes. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm out of gas. Is there anyone here?" Still no answer. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight. I stepped closer to the door, trying to see if there was anyone in the shadows. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, but as I got closer, it grew stronger. A sickly, metallic odor that made my stomach turn. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open wider. The back room was a mess, cluttered with broken furniture and piles of junk. In the corner, I saw what looked like a sleeping bag, crumpled and stained. Next to it was a pile of empty cans and food wrappers. Someone had been living here recently. The smell was stronger now, almost overwhelming. I covered my nose with my sleeve, my eyes scanning the room for the source. And then I saw it. A dark stain on the floor, spreading out from beneath the sleeping bag. My mind struggled to process what I was looking at, but deep down I knew. It was blood. A lot of it. Panic set in. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I needed to get out of here. I turned and bolted for the door, my footsteps echoing in the empty station. As I reached the exit, I heard the shuffling sound again, louder this time. It was coming from outside, near my car. I froze, my hand on the door. My car was my only way out, but if someone was out there, I didn't want to think about what that meant. I peeked through the window, trying to see if I could spot anything. The darkness outside was almost complete, but the faint light from the neon sign illuminated the area around my car. That's when I saw the figure. A man standing near the driver's side door, his back to me. He was tall and thin, wearing a tattered jacket and jeans. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at my car. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know if he had seen me, but I wasn't about to wait and find out. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I needed to think. I couldn't stay here, but I couldn't just walk up to my car with him standing there. I looked around the station for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing, just empty shelves and broken furniture. The man outside moved, turning slightly as if he was looking around. I ducked down behind the counter, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't see him anymore, but I could hear his footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. He was moving, circling the car. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I needed to get to the car. If I could just make it inside and lock the doors, I might have a chance. I waited, listening to the sound of his footsteps. When they moved to the far side of the car, I made my move. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and sprinting towards the car. The man saw me, his head snapping up as I ran. He shouted something, but I didn't stop to listen. I yanked the driver's side door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut and locking it in one motion. He was on me in seconds, pounding on the window with his fists. His face was contorted with rage, his eyes wild. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life and I slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, throwing him off balance. He stumbled back, and I took the opportunity to speed away, the tires kicking up gravel as I peeled out of the station. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there watching me go. His figure grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the darkness. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. An hour later, I pulled into a brightly lit gas station and parked near the pumps, my hands still trembling. I told the attendant what had happened, and they called the police. I gave my statement, describing the man and the gas station as best as I could. A few days later, I got a call from the authorities. They had investigated the station but found no sign of the man. The back room was exactly as I had described, bloodstains and all, but there were no bodies, no evidence of who the blood belonged to. They told me the station had been abandoned for years, a relic of a bygone era. Whoever the man was, he was long gone. To this day, I don't know what happened at that gas station or who the man was, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes as he pounded on my window, or the suffocating silence of that desolate stretch of highway. It was a reminder that sometimes, the scariest things in life aren't ghosts or monsters, but the darkness that exists in the hearts of men. The crunch of gravel under my boots was the only sound breaking the stillness as I made my way deeper into the forest. The trail had been quiet for hours with no sign of other hikers. That was exactly what I wanted. Isolation, peace, and the chance to clear my head. Life back in the city had been relentless lately, and this solo camping trip was my escape. My backpack felt heavy, even though I'd packed light: a tent, sleeping bag, some freeze-dried meals, water purification tablets, a knife, and a first aid kit. I'd hiked this trail once before, years ago, but only for a day trip. This time, I planned to spend 2 nights out here. I'd scoured maps and online forums to pick a spot far off the main trail where I'd be unlikely to run into anyone else. By late afternoon, I reached the area I'd marked on my map. The trees here were dense, their tall trunks forming a canopy that let through only scattered shafts of sunlight. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. I found a small clearing near a stream, a perfect spot to set up camp. The stream was narrow but flowed steadily, its water crystal clear. It would be my source for drinking water and cooking. I pitched my tent quickly, practiced from years of weekend camping trips. The ground was soft but dry, and I secured the stakes firmly. I gathered some rocks to create a fire pit, then collected dry wood and kindling from the forest floor. By the time I had everything ready, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Dinner was simple: a freeze-dried pasta meal rehydrated with boiling water. I ate it by the small fire I'd built, listening to the soft gurgle of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves. As darkness settled in, the forest around me came alive with the sounds of insects and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. I felt a deep sense of calm, the kind that only comes from being far away from the noise and chaos of civilization. After cleaning up and securing my food in a bear-proof bag hung high in a tree, I crawled into my tent. The thin nylon walls felt flimsy against the vastness of the wilderness, but they were enough to keep out the bugs and the chill. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, the weight of the day's hike pulling me into sleep almost immediately. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The forest was pitch black, the kind of darkness that makes you feel like you're floating in a void. My watch read 2:13 a.m. I lay still, straining to hear something over the pounding of my heart. It was then that I noticed the absence of the usual forest sounds. The insects had gone silent, and even the stream seemed quieter than before. I told myself it was nothing. Animals move through the forest at night, and their presence can cause other creatures to go quiet. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My instincts, honed by years of camping, were telling me to stay alert. Eventually, the sounds of the forest returned, and I managed to drift back to sleep. When I woke again, it was dawn. The air was cold and crisp, and a light mist hung over the ground. I shook off the unease from the night before, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I left most of my gear at the campsite, carrying only a day pack with water, snacks, and my knife. The forest here was beautiful, with towering trees and patches of sunlight filtering through the canopy. I followed the stream upstream, stopping occasionally to admire the scenery or take a sip of water. About an hour into my hike, I came across something unexpected. It was a shoe, muddy and partially buried in the soft ground near the stream. It looked old, the kind of heavy-duty hiking boot you'd expect an experienced outdoorsman to wear. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The sole was worn, and the laces were frayed. There was no sign of its owner. I looked around, but there was nothing else nearby. No bag, no clothing, no other footprints in the mud. It was strange, but I figured someone might have lost it while crossing the stream or moving through the area. I left the shoe where I found it and continued on. As the day went on, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. I kept feeling like I was being watched, though every time I turned around, there was nothing but trees and shadows. By the time I made it back to my campsite, the sun was already low in the sky. That evening, I built another fire and tried to relax, but my nerves were on edge. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig seemed amplified, my imagination conjuring images of predators or something worse. I reminded myself that I was alone out here, that there was nothing to fear but my own thoughts. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would come quickly. Instead, I lay awake for hours, my ears tuned to every sound. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke with a start to the sound of something outside my tent. It was faint at first, a soft crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart raced as I lay completely still, straining to hear more. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't the random rustling of an animal. It was deliberate, rhythmic. Someone was walking around my campsite. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. My mind raced with possibilities. Another hiker? A hunter? Someone who had no business being out here? I waited, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. Then silence. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. I didn't dare move or make a sound. Finally, I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away. I waited until I was sure they were gone before unzipping the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim glow over the clearing. There was no one in sight. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and exhaustion. I didn't sleep, keeping my knife close and my ears tuned to every sound. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could. I didn't even stop to make breakfast. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the forest remained empty, the only sounds the crunch of my boots and the occasional call of a bird. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost brought me to tears. I never found out who or what was outside my tent that night. Maybe it was another camper, though the thought of someone wandering around my campsite in the middle of the night without announcing themselves is unsettling. Maybe it was just an animal, though the deliberate footsteps suggested otherwise. Whatever it was, it reminded me of something important. The wilderness is unpredictable. It's beautiful and serene, but it's also indifferent. Out there, you're vulnerable in a way you rarely feel in everyday life. I still love camping, but now I'm more cautious. I double-check my gear, choose campsites closer to established trails, and always trust my instincts. The forest may be peaceful, but it's never entirely safe. I remember the morning I decided to go hiking on a secluded trail. It wasn't a particularly famous route or something that came up in many guides. It was one of those paths hidden deep in the woods, the kind that promises solitude and peace. At least that's what I was hoping for when I started. I had always enjoyed hiking. Being outdoors, away from the hustle of everyday life, gave me a sense of calm that I couldn't quite find anywhere else. The weather was perfect that day. Cool, crisp, with the sun filtering through the canopy of leaves above. The kind of day that made you feel like nothing could go wrong. I packed my backpack the night before, filled it with snacks, water, a first aid kit, and a jacket just in case. I knew better than to head out without the essentials, even for a day hike. The trail was supposed to take a few hours, and I planned to be back before sunset. When I parked my car at the trailhead, there was only one other vehicle in the lot. An old SUV that looked like it had been there a while. No people. The parking lot was quiet, and for a second, I wondered if I should have picked a more popular trail. But I brushed the thought away. I liked the idea of being alone, just me and the woods. I started walking, and the quiet of the forest immediately surrounded me. It was the kind of quiet that presses in on you, the kind where you can hear the soft crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant hum of insects in the trees. The path was narrow and winding, surrounded by thick brush. I couldn't see far ahead, but that only added to the feeling of being deep in nature. For the first hour or so, everything was perfect. The trail was gentle, winding through tall trees and thick ferns. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I breathed in the earthy smell of pine and damp soil. The air felt fresh, cool in the shade of the trees. I took my time, stopping occasionally to drink some water or snap a photo. It was a peaceful kind of quiet, the sort that calms the mind. But as I walked further into the woods, things started to change. The trail became steeper, and the trees seemed to grow denser. The shadows deepened, and the path started to narrow. I could no longer hear the sound of birds or the faint hum of insects. It was almost as if the woods had swallowed up all the usual sounds, leaving only the rustling of leaves and my own footsteps. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was just part of the hike. The deeper into the forest you go, the quieter it gets. But after a while, I started to feel uneasy. It was subtle at first, a vague feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced behind me and saw nothing but the trail, still winding through the trees. I couldn't even hear my own breathing anymore. It was just too quiet. As I pressed on, the path seemed to twist in odd ways, like it was leading me deeper into the heart of the woods. The trees grew closer together, their trunks thick and gnarled. I had expected a scenic view or a clearing by this point, but there was nothing, just more trees, more shadows. I kept looking for signs of other hikers, but there was no one. The air felt thick, and every step I took seemed to echo louder than the last. And then I noticed something strange. The trail markers. I had been following these little wooden signs every so often, the kind that tell you which way to go. But the last one I had seen was a while ago. I stopped for a moment, looking around. The trail had split just ahead of me, but I wasn't sure which direction to go. Both paths looked equally worn. I decided to take the left path, thinking I had passed that way earlier in my hike. The deeper I went, the stranger it felt. There were no more sounds of wildlife, no rustling leaves from animals, no bird songs, just an oppressive silence. I tried to shake the feeling off, telling myself that it was just my imagination. It was a long trail after all, and it's easy to start feeling isolated when you're alone in the woods. But the farther I went, the more I couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling in my chest. At some point, I stopped to take a break. I pulled out my water and took a long drink, trying to calm my nerves. I sat on a rock for a moment, staring at the path ahead. Something about the way the trees leaned over the trail, their twisted branches reaching out like hands, made my skin crawl. It was like the forest itself was closing in on me, pressing in tighter with every step. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. It was just a remote part of the forest, nothing more. But as I stood up to continue, I noticed something strange. There was a set of footprints on the trail, fresh ones. They weren't mine. I knew they weren't mine because they were bigger, heavier. The prints were deep, as if someone had walked through recently. My heart skipped a beat. I stood there, staring at the footprints. I thought about turning back, retracing my steps, but something told me that wasn't the best idea. The trail behind me looked just as unnerving now. So, I kept walking, hoping to find some sign of life, maybe another hiker or even a trail sign. But the deeper I went, the worse it got. The trees seemed to grow even closer together, blocking out the little bit of sunlight that had been shining through earlier. I felt like I was being watched, and it wasn't just the feeling of being alone in the woods. There was something else, something more pressing. My breath was shallow, my pulse quickening. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, and there was no sign of the end. And then I heard something, a rustling in the bushes to my left. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of something moving, something big, pushing through the underbrush. I turned to look, but there was nothing there, just the trees. My heart was pounding in my chest now, and my instincts were telling me to leave, to get out of there fast. I quickened my pace, but the feeling of being followed stayed with me. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing, just trees and shadows. But it felt wrong. Felt like something was lurking just out of sight. I reached for my phone, but when I checked it, there was no signal. I wasn't surprised. I had known there wouldn't be reception out here, but that didn't help the sense of isolation that was growing stronger. I pressed on, moving faster now, almost running at points, my legs burning from the exertion. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The rustling in the bushes started again, louder this time. I turned sharply, my heart in my throat, but once again, there was nothing. Finally, I saw something up ahead, clearing. It was a small one, just a few trees, but it was a break in the thick woods. I didn't care. I ran toward it, desperate for a moment of open space, something that felt less suffocating. I emerged into the clearing, and for a moment, I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart racing. The air here was clearer, the trees fewer. I could see the sky above me again. But even in the clearing, I didn't feel safe. The feeling of being followed hadn't left me. It was still there, hanging in the air. I stood in the center of the clearing, trying to gather myself. I knew I needed to make a decision. I couldn't stay here, and I couldn't keep going forward. I glanced around the clearing one more time, then saw it. A trail marker. A small wooden post, half hidden by the tall grass. I hadn't seen it earlier, and I had passed it without realizing. I walked toward it, scanning the ground for more signs. There was a faded arrow carved into the wood, pointing in the opposite direction. It led back toward the trail I had originally taken. Relief flooded through me. This was the way out. I took a deep breath and turned back, following the marker. The path felt different now, less oppressive. It was still quiet, but it was no longer suffocating. The trees seemed to part just a little, and I could hear the distant sound of wind rustling the leaves. Slowly, the feeling of being followed faded. My breath steadied, and the weight on my chest began to lift. I walked for what felt like hours, but finally, I saw the familiar shape of my car in the distance. The parking lot was still empty, just the old SUV parked where it had been. I didn't care. I was out of the woods. My legs were sore, my feet ached, and I was exhausted, but I was safe. I got into my car, slammed the door behind me, and took one last look at the trailhead. I couldn't explain what had happened out there, but I didn't need to. What mattered was that I had made it out. As I drove away, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I didn't need to look back. I had learned one important thing that day. Some trails are better left unexplored. I can still smell the damp earth and hear the faint crackle of the fire from that night. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a weekend in the woods to escape the noise of the city. I've always found peace in the wilderness, the solitude, the stillness, the humbling vastness of it all. It's something I've sought for years. This trip was no different, or so I thought. I parked my car at the edge of a gravel road that cut through the forest. The air was crisp, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. My pack was heavy, loaded with essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a first aid kit. I double-checked everything before heading down the trail. I'd chosen a spot deep in the forest, far from the designated camping areas. The idea was to be alone, away from the hum of RV generators and the chatter of fellow campers. I wanted to immerse myself in nature, to truly disconnect. The hike to the campsite took about 3 hours. The trail was narrow and winding, bordered by towering pines and clusters of ferns. The forest was alive with sound, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, the occasional scamper of something small and unseen. It was comforting, like nature's own symphony. I felt at ease, my steps light as I navigated the uneven terrain. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I'd marked on my map. It was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by trees, with a gentle slope leading down to a stream. The water was clear and cold, and I could see small fish darting between the rocks. I set up my tent on a patch of flat ground, taking care to clear away any sticks and stones. The fire pit came next, a simple ring of rocks with dry wood stacked neatly in the center. As the sun began to set, I lit the fire. The flames danced and crackled, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. I cooked a simple meal, instant noodles and a can of beans, and ate in silence, listening to the forest around me. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. A twig snapping in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I told myself it was nothing, just the normal noises of the forest. By the time the fire burned down to glowing embers, the sky was a blanket of stars. I crawled into my tent, zipping the flap closed behind me. My sleeping bag was warm and comforting, and I drifted off to sleep with the sound of the stream in my ears. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The tent was dark, and the forest was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that presses down on you, making you acutely aware of your own breathing. I lay still, straining to hear anything. A rustle, a chirp, a distant howl. Nothing. Then I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching on the dry leaves outside my tent. My first thought was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but these steps were heavier, more deliberate. They moved with purpose, circling the tent. My stomach tightened, and I held my breath, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. I've always been cautious when camping. I carry bear spray and keep my food stored properly to avoid attracting wildlife. But this didn't feel like an animal. The footsteps paused, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Whoever or whatever it was standing just outside my tent. My mind raced. Should I call out? Pretend I'm not here? I reached for the knife I kept in my pack, gripping it tightly. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The footsteps resumed, moving away from the tent. I waited until the sound faded completely before unzipping the flap just enough to peek outside. The fire pit was dark, the clearing illuminated only by moonlight. I couldn't see anyone, but the unease lingered. I told myself it was probably a hiker who had stumbled upon my campsite. Maybe they didn't realize I was here and left when they figured it out. I didn't sleep much after that. Every sound made me jump, and I kept the knife within reach. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from the tent, bleary-eyed but relieved to see the sunlight. The forest felt different in the daylight, less intimidating. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I packed up my gear, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human footprints circling my tent. They were fresh, pressed into the damp earth, and they definitely weren't mine. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who had been out here in the middle of the night? And why had they been circling my tent? I decided to cut the trip short. The thought of spending another night out here made my skin crawl. I hoisted my pack and started back down the trail, my senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About halfway back to the car, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. A piece of red fabric snagged on a branch. It looked like part of a shirt or jacket, torn and weathered. It wasn't mine, and I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. My stomach churned as I realized it could belong to the person who had been outside my tent. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting to the shadows between the trees. By the time I reached my car, I was out of breath, my shirt soaked with sweat. I threw my pack into the trunk and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the gravel road, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds. When I finally made it home, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, but the experience stayed with me. For weeks, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints or the sound of those deliberate footsteps outside my tent. I still don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just a lost hiker. Maybe it was something more sinister. All I know is that I've never felt truly alone in the woods since. I've always loved hiking alone. Clears my head, gives me space to think. Being out in nature, away from the noise of everyday life, makes me feel like I'm in control. No schedules, no emails, no distractions. Just me and the wilderness. That's why I planned a solo trip to the backcountry trails of the Pacific Northwest. I picked a route that was supposed to take about 3 days to complete. It wasn't particularly well-traveled, which made it perfect. Or at least that's what I thought. The first day was peaceful. I started my hike early, the morning sun barely cutting through the thick mist that hung between the towering evergreens. The scent of damp earth and pine needles filled the air. I followed a narrow dirt trail, winding past moss-covered rocks and fallen logs, the sound of birds and distant water filling the silence. My pack was heavy, but I was used to it. I'd packed light, tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, and a map. I had no cell service out here, but I had my compass and GPS watch. I wasn't worried. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing next to a slow-moving river. It was an ideal spot to set up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and sat down by the water to eat. As I listened to the gentle current, I felt a strange unease settle over me. Not fear exactly, just something. Maybe it was the quiet. Too quiet. Normally, you'd hear animals moving through the underbrush, insects buzzing, the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. But it was dead silent. I shook it off, blaming it on my overactive imagination. I was alone after all. No one was out here. I checked my GPS one last time before bed. Everything looked fine. My camp was about 8 miles from the trailhead, and I planned to cover another 10 miles tomorrow. I zipped up my tent, lay down, and let the exhaustion take over. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. Something had snapped a branch nearby. I held my breath, listening. Then, another sound. This time softer, like the rustling of leaves. I reached for my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The moon cast long shadows across the trees. Nothing moved. My heart pounded. Maybe it was just a deer. Still, I sat up for a while, gripping my knife, scanning the darkness until sleep finally took me again. Morning came, and I felt stupid for letting my nerves get to me. I packed up and continued the hike. The trail became rougher, climbing higher into the mountains. The further I went, the more unsettling the forest felt. The silence from the night before never really lifted. I noticed something else too. There were no animal tracks. No deer, no raccoons, not even birds flitting between branches. It was like everything had just left. I pushed the thoughts aside and kept moving. By midday, I reached a ridge with an incredible view of the valley below. I sat on a rock to rest, sipping from my water bottle. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a faint path leading down the ridge, one that wasn't marked on my map. It wasn't an animal trail either. It was too wide, too deliberate. It looked old, overgrown, but still there. My curiosity got the better of me. Maybe it was a forgotten shortcut or an old logging road. I decided to follow it. The deeper I went, the more the feeling of unease grew. The trees here were different, older, their bark gnarled and dark. The air was thicker, heavy with the scent of rot. I stepped over tangled roots and ducked under low-hanging branches, my boots crunching on the soft earth. After about a mile, I came across something that made my stomach turn. It was a cabin, or what was left of one. The roof had partially caved in, the wood blackened with age and dampness. The door hung open, barely clinging to its rusted hinges. I should have turned around right then. I should have left, but something about the place held me there, like a weight pressing on my chest. I stepped closer, peering inside. The floor was covered in debris, fallen beams, broken glass, what looked like old animal bones. A rusted bed frame sat against one wall, the mattress long gone. There was a table too, its surface scratched and warped. And then I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. A notebook, sitting right in the middle of the table, open, as if someone had just been reading it. I hesitated, then reached for it. The pages were damp, the ink smudged, but I could still make out the words. The entries were short, scattered. Descriptions of strange noises, missing supplies, a feeling of being watched. The last entry was barely legible, the words scrawled in shaky handwriting. Asterisk, it's still out there. It doesn't want me to leave. Asterisk, a sound came from outside. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate. My heart slammed against my ribs. I moved as quietly as I could, setting the notebook down and stepping back toward the door. The footsteps stopped. I couldn't see anything past the tree line, just dense forest. But I felt it. Something was there, watching. I turned and ran. Branches tore at my clothes as I scrambled back up the path, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. My pack bounced against my shoulders, the weight slowing me down, but I didn't dare stop. I didn't look back. I just ran until I saw the main trail again, my legs shaking beneath me. I didn't stop there either. I kept going, pushing myself forward, fueled by pure adrenaline. By the time I finally reached my campsite from the night before, I could barely breathe. I dropped my pack and collapsed onto the ground, my whole body trembling. I listened. Nothing. Just silence. The same eerie silence that had followed me since yesterday. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, gripping my knife, staring into the darkness. Every snapped twig, every shift in the wind sent my nerves into overdrive. I didn't know what I had seen, or if I had seen anything at all. But I knew one thing. I wasn't welcome here. At the first light of dawn, I packed up and started hiking back toward the trailhead. I didn't stop to rest, didn't even eat. I just kept moving, my eyes scanning the trees, my ears straining for any sound of movement. The feeling of being watched never left me. It took me nearly the entire day, but when I finally saw my car through the trees, I nearly collapsed with relief. I threw my pack in the back seat, locked the doors, and sped down the empty road without looking back. I don't know what was out there. Maybe nothing. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But I'll never forget that feeling, that deep, primal fear, and I'll never go back to that trail again. The sun had just begun to dip behind the distant hills as I set out on my hike. I'd been planning this for weeks, picking the perfect trail. It wasn't too popular, but it wasn't entirely isolated either. Just the kind of place to lose yourself in nature without running into a crowd. The morning had been bright, the air fresh, but now, as I strapped my pack tighter and adjusted my boots, a slight chill had settled over the landscape. I glanced around at the woods that seemed so welcoming. The trail was narrow, winding, and covered in a layer of damp fallen leaves. I liked that feeling, the quiet rustling of the forest, the fresh smell of earth, and the sound of distant birds. It all felt like the perfect escape from the chaos of daily life. With a deep breath, I began walking. The first hour went by without incident, and I found myself enjoying the solitude. The trees on either side of the path were thick with moss, their trunks gnarled and twisted, like they had stories to tell. I found myself distracted by the forest's beauty, how the sunlight filtered through the canopy in soft rays, making the leaves shimmer. I had forgotten how calming it was to be out here, away from the noise of the city. But then something happened. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed a piece of torn fabric caught on a branch. I stopped, leaning closer to examine it. It wasn't much, just a small scrap of dark green material. It looked old, the edges frayed as if it had been there for a while. I pulled my pack a little tighter, suddenly aware of the creeping sensation down my spine. There was nothing to suggest anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the thought that someone else had been through here recently. I shrugged it off. I was overthinking it. The trail had seen plenty of hikers, and it wasn't as if I was alone. There were other people who had hiked it before me, right? But the further I walked, the less sure I felt. The trail seemed to grow quieter, as though the forest itself had gone still. The wind stopped, the birds stopped chirping. All I could hear now was the crunch of my boots against the ground. It had only been a couple of hours, but the daylight was fading faster than I expected. The dense canopy above blocked out most of the twilight, leaving the path dim and shadowed. I checked my watch. Maybe I should turn back, but the thought of retracing my steps didn't sit well with me. I come this far and I wasn't going to cut it short. The trail began to narrow further, the trees pressing in on both sides. I could see where the path had been washed out in places, with thick roots emerging from the earth like veins in the ground. I tried to step lightly, careful not to trip. The quiet was unsettling now, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint squeak of distant branches. Just as I was about to dismiss the eerie sensation creeping up on me, I saw something ahead. It was a small clearing, just big enough to allow a view of the horizon through the trees. I walked into it cautiously, drawn by the strange pull of the open space. The ground here was covered in soft moss, and the air felt slightly warmer, as though the sun still clung to this spot despite the setting of the day. And then I saw it. A small wooden cabin stood in the distance, half hidden by overgrown shrubs and vines. It was so out of place. No other structures had been mentioned on the map, and I certainly hadn't read about any cabins in the area. I didn't even know if it was abandoned or still in use, but there it was, old and worn, with peeling paint and windows that looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. I felt an involuntary shiver crawl up my spine. My first instinct was to turn around, to head back the way I came. Something about that cabin felt wrong, but curiosity won out. Maybe it was just my imagination. I walked closer, every step slow, deliberate, as if I were about to disturb something sacred. The closer I got, the more I noticed details I hadn't seen at first. There were small hand-carved symbols etched into the wood, faint and faded by time, as though they'd been scratched into the surface long ago. A sudden breeze blew through the trees, and I thought I heard something, a whisper. But when I stopped to listen, all I heard was the rustling of leaves. I reached the cabin and peered through one of the dirty windows. The inside was dark, the light barely enough to reveal shadows. It looked like it had been abandoned for a long time. Furniture covered in dust, and what appeared to be a stack of old newspapers lying in a corner. I considered going inside. Maybe I'd find something interesting, maybe just a strange relic of someone's past. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be here. I stood there for a moment, staring at the cabin, unsure of what to do next. The sinking sun cast long shadows across the ground, and the air seemed to thicken with tension. I looked around, and for the first time I realized how quiet the world had become. The forest was holding its breath. A crackling noise broke the silence, sharp and sudden. My heart skipped a beat. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. It was only the wind moving a branch, or perhaps some small animal scurrying in the underbrush. But in that moment, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled into my chest. I decided it was time to go. The last thing I wanted was to be caught in the dark in a place that felt so off. I made my way back along the trail, keeping my pace steady. But as I walked, I couldn't help but feel as though I was being followed, not by a person, but by something far less tangible. The air seemed heavier now, oppressive even. I quickened my pace, my footsteps becoming louder in the quiet of the forest. The feeling of being watched never left me. The trees seemed closer, the shadows deeper. I tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to me like a second skin. When I finally reached the point where the trail forked, I let out a sigh of relief. The main path was just ahead, and I was close enough to the end that I could see the distant clearing where I had started earlier. The sun was nearly gone now, but there was enough light left to guide me. But then, as I stepped toward the familiar path, something made me stop. Something wasn't right. I looked around, my eyes darting over the trees, and that's when I saw it. The cabin. It was no longer in the distance. It was there right in front of me, just off the trail, hidden by trees. How had it moved? How could it be there now? I stood frozen, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The logical part of me screamed that it couldn't be real, but the cabin was there, unmistakable in its decrepitude. I could see the faded paint and the carved symbols once again, and the feeling of being watched, it was stronger now. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't move. I stared at the cabin as if it were some sort of puzzle that needed solving, but it only deepened my sense of dread. And then it hit me. I was lost, completely and utterly lost. The trail I had been following was no longer there. The trees had closed in around me in ways they hadn't before, and the path I had walked on so confidently was gone. I had no idea how I had ended up back here at the cabin. My throat tightened, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. My phone had no signal, and I had no way to call for help. The weight of the situation hit me all at once. I had to think clearly. Slowly, I turned around. My only choice was to go back the way I had come. I walked away from the cabin, trying to steady my breathing, but I didn't look back again. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the point where the trail forked again. This time, there was no cabin. There was no lingering presence, no whispers in the trees, just the familiar path that led me back to the clearing. I was shaken but relieved. I had made it out. The hike was over, and I could see the distant parking lot where my car was parked. As I walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, that something in the forest had changed me. I may have been alone, but I knew I would never feel alone again. The woods had a way of creeping into your soul, even when you didn't see it coming. The trail may have been over, but the sense of unease lingered long after I left the forest behind. I couldn't explain it, but I didn't need to. The woods had a way of getting into your mind, and once it did, it never truly let go. I had planned this solo hiking trip for months. I wanted to disconnect from the world for a while, be away from the noise, from the constant distractions of life. The route I picked was deep in the mountains, a trail not many people take, which was exactly why I chose it. I wanted silence, solitude, and nature. The weather was perfect when I started. Cool, crisp air, the scent of pine filling my lungs. I packed everything carefully. Enough food for a few days, plenty of water, a small tent, a knife, a first aid kit, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I knew what I was doing. I wasn't a beginner at this. The first few hours were peaceful. The trees stretched endlessly, their branches swaying gently. Birds chirped in the distance. The dirt trail was narrow, winding up the steep incline. My boots crunched against the gravel with every step. I felt good. By afternoon, I was deep in the woods. The sunlight barely broke through the thick canopy above, leaving the forest dim even in daylight. I had expected this. What I didn't expect was the silence. The birds had stopped chirping. The wind had died down. Even my own footsteps seemed muted. I told myself it was nothing, Maybe I had just gotten used to the sounds, but the feeling sat heavy in my gut. Something was off. I kept moving. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The trail looked different than I remembered from the map. The trees seemed taller, the shadows longer. I checked my GPS. It showed I was still on the right path, but something about the landscape felt wrong. Then I noticed it. The footprints. They weren't mine, and they weren't fresh. The dirt around them was slightly dry, meaning they had been there for at least a day. They were deep, like whoever left them was carrying something heavy. I crouched down and looked closer. The pattern was strange. Whoever made them had been walking in the same direction as me, but then suddenly veered off into the trees. There was no sign of them returning to the path. I stood up, trying to shake off the nervous energy building inside me. Maybe it was just another hiker who went off-trail to explore. But still, why did they leave the path so abruptly? I kept going, keeping my pace steady. The sun was starting to lower, painting the sky orange. I needed to set up camp soon. I found a good spot. A small clearing surrounded by trees, far enough from the main trail that I wouldn't be disturbed. I set up my tent quickly, ate a small meal, and sat for a while, listening. The forest had gone completely silent again. That night, I woke up to something moving outside my tent. I froze. It wasn't the rustling of a small animal. It was slow, deliberate. Footsteps. I held my breath. My mind raced. A bear? A mountain lion? No, it was different. The steps weren't heavy enough for a bear, and they weren't the quick, light steps of an animal. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. Then silence. I waited, my heart pounding. I didn't hear anything else. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I wasn't sure. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back into a restless sleep. In the morning, I stepped outside to check the area. The dirt around my tent had been disturbed. Footprints. Human. They circled my tent, then led back into the woods. Someone had been watching me. Panic set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I packed my things quickly. I needed to leave. Now, I checked my GPS again. I was still on the right path, but I picked up my pace. The uneasy feeling in my gut had turned into full-blown fear. For hours, I hiked without stopping. My mind kept replaying the night before. Who was out there? Why didn't they do anything? Were they waiting for something? Then I saw it. A backpack. It was lying just off the trail, half buried under leaves. I hesitated, then slowly walked toward it. It looked old, the fabric torn in places, the zippers rusted. I crouched down and unzipped the main compartment. Clothes, a water bottle, a flashlight, a notebook. I picked up the notebook and flipped through it. The handwriting was shaky, frantic. I read a few lines. I hear them at night. They don't leave. They just watch. I tried to leave, but the trail keeps changing. I don't think I'm alone. If someone finds this, get out. Don't stop. Just keep moving. My blood ran cold. I dropped the notebook and stood up. My breathing was too fast. My hands were shaking. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not far. I didn't think. I ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I didn't care about the direction. I just needed to get out of there. Branches scratched my arms. Roots caught my feet, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. Then I saw it. The road. A thin strip of asphalt cutting through the trees. Civilization. I stumbled toward it, my whole body trembling. When I reached the road, I turned back one last time. The trees stood still, the forest silent. But I knew I wasn't alone. I walked until I found a passing car. The driver pulled over, and I climbed in without a word. I never went back to that trail. I never wanted to know who or what had been out there with me, and I never will. I packed my gear carefully, making sure to double-check everything. A few days in the woods alone. That's what I had been looking forward to.
No distractions.
Just me, nature, and some peace and quiet. I'd been feeling overwhelmed lately with work, life, and everything that came with it. A camping trip was supposed to clear my head, to give me that time away. I wasn't expecting anything to go wrong. I drove for hours until the trailhead was in sight, the place I'd picked for my solo camping trip. It wasn't a popular spot, which was exactly what I wanted. Most people went to the big national parks, but this was smaller, quieter, a patch of forest not marked on every map. When I pulled in, there was no one else around. Not a car in sight, just the trees and the stillness. I set up my tent, hung my food in a tree far away from where I'd sleep, and lit a small fire. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows between the trees, the air crisp. I sat by the fire, the crackle of the wood the only sound. Felt good to be alone, to just sit in the quiet with nothing to do but think. I had no agenda, no worries. That night, the wind picked up and the temperature dropped quickly. The fire kept me warm, though, and I settled into the comfort of my sleeping bag, the sound of the fire still crackling in the background. The forest outside seemed peaceful, a little eerie in its own way, but peaceful. Then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard something, a snap. It was soft, faint, but it was there. My heart skipped a beat. I listened for a second, but the sounds of the forest, crickets, wind in the trees, filled the air again. I shook it off, reminding myself I was alone in the woods. It was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or something smaller, like a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I couldn't tell what, but it was a feeling in my gut, one that made me pull the sleeping bag tighter around me. It wasn't fear exactly. It was just that sense that something was different, out of place. I finally fell asleep, but not deeply. Every little sound made my eyes snap open. The wind rustling the leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional crackle of the fire. At one point, I heard what seemed like footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps. They didn't sound like the usual forest noises. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. I waited. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal again, maybe a large one like a bear. But why would it be so deliberate? Why so slow? I sat up in my tent, looking out the small window, but I could only see the outline of trees, their shadows stretching long in the moonlight. The forest was so quiet now, as if it held its breath with me. After a long while, I got up, deciding to check the area. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, careful not to make too much noise. The air was cold, and the wind had died down, leaving everything still. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the ground, expecting to see animal tracks. Instead, the beam caught something odd. In the dirt, just outside the ring of my firelight, were large footprints. They were too big to be a deer, too wide for any bear I'd ever seen. I bent down, my fingers trembling as I traced the outline of the prints in the dirt. There was something off about them, almost human, but not quite. The depth, the size, nothing about them felt normal. I stood up, a knot forming in my stomach. A cold shiver ran through me, and I felt the need to get back to my tent. Fast. I turned, but just as I was about to take a step, a twig snapped behind me. It was too loud to be an animal, too deliberate to be just the wind. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand, but saw nothing. No movement, no figure, only the dark, towering trees around me. My mind raced. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just overthinking it. But the feeling in my chest told me otherwise. I grabbed my gear, my flashlight flicking around in a panic now, and rushed back to my tent. I zipped it up as fast as I could, my heart pounding. Inside, I tried to calm myself. The footprints had spooked me. The sound had spooked me, but I couldn't let fear take over. It was just me out here, and I had to remind myself of that. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every few minutes, I would hear something. A rustling, a snap, a distant thud, and I would snap awake, sitting up in the dark. I checked the food hanging from the tree. It was still there, untouched. Nothing had disturbed it. Maybe I was imagining things. But then, in the distance, I heard something that wasn't in my imagination. A howl. It was distant, but unmistakable. A long, drawn-out cry that echoed through the woods. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a wolf, not the kind of howl I knew. It was something deeper, more guttural. The sound of it crawled up my spine, leaving a trail of dread. I sat in silence, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in this forest, that whatever made that noise was getting closer. I laid there, staring at the fabric of the tent, listening intently. But nothing happened for a while. The forest outside remained quiet, and I began to convince myself that it was just an animal, something I had never heard before. Maybe a coyote, maybe some other creature making an unusual sound. Just as I began to relax, I heard it again, this time closer, much closer. The howl was louder now, rising in pitch, a strange, disturbing sound. Sent a wave of panic through me. I grabbed my flashlight again, hands shaking, and I turned it on, shining the beam out through the tent. Nothing. The area around me was still. No movement, just trees. The shadows of the night were thick, and the beam of light barely cut through them. I stayed still, breathing shallowly, trying to keep my composure. What if something was out there? Something I hadn't heard before? Something no one had seen? My mind raced with possibilities. I heard the footsteps again, unmistakable, soft but deliberate. This time it was definitely too close for comfort. Too close for comfort. I glanced out the small window of my tent. The beam of my flashlight caught a movement, a shadow. My heart dropped. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, a figure, standing just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the darkness. I froze. My pulse thundered in my ears. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was watching me. I don't know how long I stayed there, my breath caught in my throat, trying to make sense of it. It didn't make sense. Why would someone be out here? There were no trails.
No campgrounds.
Just the deep woods. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gear, my phone, and without a moment's hesitation, I started packing up. I was done. I had to leave. I didn't care if I had to walk for miles to get to the nearest road. I wasn't staying out here. Just as I was about to zip up my bag, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A voice, a soft whisper, barely audible, like it was carried by the wind. Leave. It wasn't a human voice, at least not one that sounded normal. It was hollow, cold, and almost metallic. I rushed out of the tent, grabbed my stuff, and without looking back, I started running. The forest seemed to close in around me. Every snap of a twig felt like someone was following me. Every rustle in the bushes felt like it was right behind me. I ran as fast as I could, heart hammering, feet stumbling, adrenaline coursing through me. I didn't care about the dark anymore. I didn't care about the fear. I just needed to get out. I didn't stop until I reached my car, breathless, trembling, and drenched in sweat. I slammed the door shut and locked it, just sitting there for a moment, trying to regain my bearings. I didn't know what I had seen out there or who or what was out there, but I was sure of one thing: I would never go back. The forest was meant to be peaceful, but out there, I learned that sometimes the quiet is just the calm before something else. Something I didn't want to know more about.